Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we dive into one of the most fascinating tales of ancient Greek mythology, the story of King Midas, a legend that has captivated imaginations for centuries and continues to resonate with lessons about greed, desire, and the human condition. King Midas, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Phrygia, is remembered not only for his wealth and opulence but also for the extraordinary gift, or perhaps curse, that came to define his life, the golden touch. According to the myth, Midas was a king who loved gold above all else, his palace glittering with treasures, his halls echoing with the rustle of coins and the murmur of priceless artifacts. His obsession with wealth was well known, and it was this very desire that drew the attention of the gods, for in the world of Greek mythology, hubris and longing rarely go unnoticed by divine beings. One day, Midas performed an act of kindness for Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, returning a satyr the god had lost during his wanderings, and in gratitude, Dionysus offered Midas a single wish, a boon that would forever alter his life. Overcome by his unquenchable thirst for riches, Midas asked for the power to turn everything he touched into gold, convinced that such a gift would elevate him above all men and immortalize his name in splendor. Dionysus, cautioning him about the consequences, reluctantly granted the wish, and Midas rejoiced as he touched objects around his palace and watched them transform into shining gold, the walls of his chamber, the fruit on his table, even the flowers in his garden becoming dazzling treasures. Yet, as the initial thrill faded, Midas began to sense the perils hidden within his gift, for when he embraced his beloved daughter or attempted to enjoy a meal, his power betrayed him, turning her into solid gold and reducing sustenance to cold metal, a chilling reminder that unchecked desire often brings unforeseen suffering. The legend emphasizes not merely the allure of wealth but the profound human yearning for more, the danger of valuing possessions over relationships, and the realization that happiness cannot be bought or commanded, even by a king whose coffers overflowed with riches. Scholars and storytellers alike have explored the symbolism behind Midas' golden touch, suggesting that it represents the double-edged nature of ambition and the idea that extreme indulgence, even in seemingly positive endeavors, can yield ruin when tempered with neither wisdom nor restraint. Through the ages, artists, writers, and philosophers have retold Midas' story in myriad forms, from ancient pottery and Roman frescoes depicting the tragic transformation of objects into gold, to Renaissance paintings capturing the despair of a father unable to embrace his daughter, to modern literature and cinema where Midas' predicament becomes a metaphor for human folly, greed, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in seeking more than what is necessary. What makes the story enduring is not only its dramatic narrative but also its universal moral resonance, a cautionary tale warning against allowing material desire to overshadow compassion, love, and the simple joys of life. Midas' kingdom, once thriving and vibrant, becomes a landscape of isolation and sorrow, echoing the idea that riches without wisdom and connection lead not to fulfillment but to profound emptiness. Greek myths often intertwine the divine and the mortal, illustrating how gods interact with humans to test character, impart lessons, or punish arrogance, and Midas' tale is no exception. It teaches that even the greatest kings, endowed with power, influence, and wealth, are not immune to the consequences of their choices, particularly when their desires eclipse reason and empathy. By reflecting on Midas' journey, from his initial jubilation at the miraculous gift to the devastating realization of its limitations, we gain insight into ancient Greek values, their understanding of human nature, and the timeless truth that life's most precious treasures are not always those that glitter or weigh heavily in one's hands, but those that enrich the heart and spirit. Today, as we explore the life and legend of King Midas in this series, we will uncover not only the mythological details and historical interpretations but also the enduring lessons that resonate with modern audiences, reminding us of the fine line between ambition and avarice, the perils of unbridled desire, and the transformative power of wisdom, humility, and gratitude. So stay tuned as we journey into the world of ancient Phrygia, follow Midas' rise to opulent kingship, witness the fateful moment that changes his life forever, and delve into the rich symbolism and moral lessons that make the story of King Midas a timeless parable of human nature, wealth, and the pursuit of happiness, a tale as glittering and cautionary as the gold that once slipped through his grasp. King Midas, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Phrygia, was famed far and wide for his wealth, a kingdom where the rivers seemed to glitter with gold dust, the palace walls shimmered with gilded reliefs, and the air carried the faint scent of incense and precious metals, a testament to the prosperity and luxury over which he presided. Born into a line of kings whose fortunes were already considerable, Midas' hunger for wealth and opulence soon surpassed that of his ancestors, and he devoted himself tirelessly to amassing treasures from every corner of his realm, sending emissaries to distant lands for exotic goods, rare jewels, and the most exquisite artifacts, each acquisition elevating his status among kings and attracting admiration and envy alike. His palace was a marvel of the age, adorned with gold-plated columns, bronze statues covered in gold leaf, and carpets threaded with gold and dyed silks, while the treasury overflowed with coin and bullion. Yet despite the abundance surrounding him, Midas' desire for more remained insatiable, an unquenchable flame driving his every decision, his eyes always seeking the glitter of the next conquest or the next treasure. It was said that Midas could not pass a gold object without feeling compelled to touch it, to claim it, and thus his obsession was not merely with accumulation but with possession, a deep longing to hold the beauty and value of the world in his hands, a longing that made him blind to the pleasures of simple life and the bonds of kinship and friendship that might have otherwise grounded him. In those days, the gods watched mortals closely, and the tales of Midas' extravagance and relentless pursuit of wealth eventually reached Mount Olympus, where the gods, amused and sometimes disturbed by human folly, often intervened in subtle ways to test or teach those who drew their attention. It was during one such moment of divine interaction that Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and the wild forces of nature, wandered into Phrygia accompanied by his followers, including satyrs and maenads, creatures of mischief and festivity, who sometimes strayed too far from their god's guidance, and on this occasion, one of the satyrs became lost, wandering into the king's lands and attracting Midas' notice. Demonstrating unexpected kindness, Midas returned the lost satyr to Dionysus without hesitation, a gesture motivated less by altruism than by curiosity and the hope of favor from a god, yet it was enough to capture Dionysus' attention, who, impressed by Midas' act, or perhaps seeking to test the king, offered him a single wish, a boon that could fulfill the deepest desire of his heart. Midas, whose mind was dominated by thoughts of wealth and treasure, immediately asked for the power to turn everything he touched into gold, imagining the limitless riches that would flow from such a gift, the ability to transform his kingdom, his possessions, even the very stones beneath his feet into dazzling metal, believing that with such power, he could surpass all other rulers and secure immortality through fame and wealth. Dionysus, sensing the peril of granting such a wish, warned Midas that gifts from the gods often carried consequences, that the desire for gold could bring not only fortune but also suffering, and that the king must consider carefully whether the treasure he sought would truly bring happiness. Yet Midas, blinded by avarice, insisted, and so the god consented, bestowing upon the king the fateful golden touch, a power that would transform everything Midas touched into solid gold. At first, Midas was ecstatic, wandering through his palace and touching objects that instantly gleamed in pure, untarnished gold, the floors, the furniture, even the fruits of his gardens transformed into brilliant metal, a world of unimaginable splendor unfolding at his fingertips, confirming his belief that he had achieved the greatest boon imaginable, a divine favor unmatched in human history. Yet the thrill of his new power soon gave way to unforeseen despair, as he discovered that his golden touch was indiscriminate, transforming not only inanimate objects but also the very things he held dear. When he embraced a beloved rose from his garden, it hardened into lifeless metal, and when he tried to enjoy a meal, the food and drink turned to solid gold before it could nourish him, revealing the first signs of the tragic consequences that would come to dominate his life. The ultimate horror struck when he attempted to embrace his daughter, hoping to share with her the joy of his gift, only to find that she, too, became a lifeless statue of gold in his arms, a moment of heartbreak and realization that wealth, no matter how abundant, could never replace love or sustain the human heart, and that the king's greatest desire had brought him not happiness, but profound isolation and grief. From that day forward, Midas' kingdom, though glittering with gold, became a place of sorrow and caution, where the riches he had so fervently sought could not heal the emptiness in his heart, and where the lesson of moderation, humility, and the value of human connection became etched into the very stone and metal of his once proud halls, a lesson the ancients would remember and pass down through generations, as both a marvel of myth and a moral warning about the dangers of unchecked desire. Thus, the story of King Midas begins not only with his wealth and ambition but with a moment of divine interaction that sets in motion a chain of events, revealing the complex interplay between human longing, divine power, and the ethical and emotional consequences of choices made in pursuit of excess, a tale that continues to resonate across time, culture, and imagination. The days following the granting of his golden touch were filled with an agonizing mixture of awe and despair for King Midas, as the thrill of limitless wealth quickly gave way to the crushing reality of a gift that was as much a curse as it was a marvel, and the very pleasures he had once taken for granted now became sources of torment. Each meal he attempted to eat turned into cold, heavy metal, each cup of water solidifying in his hands before he could quench his thirst, and even the warmth of the sun and the beauty of the flowers in his gardens became reminders of what his obsession had wrought, for the world around him glittered but could no longer nourish, comfort, or bring joy. Midas wandered through his palace and gardens in increasing isolation, touching objects absent-mindedly and watching them transform into gold, a mechanical act that offered no true satisfaction, for his heart longed not for more treasures but for the simple pleasures of life that he could no longer experience. The sorrow of losing his daughter to the same inexorable power was the heaviest blow. The human connection he most cherished turned into lifeless metal, leaving Midas overwhelmed by guilt, regret, and the unbearable realization that his insatiable desire had caused irreversible harm to the one being he loved above all else, a torment that no riches could alleviate. Seeking relief, he prayed to the gods, imploring Dionysus to take back the gift that had become a burden, to reverse the power that had once seemed so glorious but now brought only suffering, and he acknowledged, with humility and sorrow, the folly of his greed and the short-sightedness of wishing for something without considering the consequences. Dionysus, moved by Midas' genuine repentance and understanding that the king had learned the painful lesson of moderation, instructed him to wash in the river Pactolus, where the waters would cleanse him of his golden touch, a moment that symbolized both the mercy of the gods and the restorative power of humility and reflection. As Midas bathed in the river, the golden hue flowed from his body into the waters, turning the sands into flecks of gold, an event that became a legendary explanation for the richness of the river, and a physical reminder that even the greatest mistakes could leave enduring legacies, both cautionary and wondrous, for future generations to ponder. Freed from the golden touch, Midas was able to embrace his daughter once more, experiencing the warmth of human connection that no treasure could ever replicate, and in that embrace, he recognized that true wealth lies not in material accumulation but in love, compassion, and the ability to cherish life and relationships, a realization that transformed him far more deeply than any gold could. From that day forward, Midas ruled Phrygia with a new wisdom, tempering ambition with compassion, wealth with generosity, and power with understanding, and though his kingdom still possessed treasures, they were no longer the measure of his happiness or the purpose of his life, for he had learned that the value of gold pales in comparison to the richness of human experience. The story of Midas' golden touch thus serves not only as a tale of extraordinary myth but as an enduring moral allegory, illustrating the dangers of unchecked greed, the transient nature of material wealth, and the importance of humility, foresight, and the prioritization of what truly sustains the human spirit. Scholars and storytellers have often highlighted the psychological and ethical dimensions of Midas' experience, noting how his obsession represents the human tendency to conflate value with possession and how the consequences of such obsessions extend beyond the individual, affecting family, society, and the natural world, thereby underscoring the interconnectedness of human actions and the moral fabric of life. Artistic depictions across centuries have captured the profound emotional depth of Midas' plight, from classical sculptures showing the rigid golden form of his daughter to Renaissance paintings that portray the king in despair, the images conveying the timeless resonance of a story that speaks to universal experiences of desire, loss, and enlightenment. Moreover, the myth emphasizes the role of divine interaction in human affairs, portraying gods not merely as arbiters of fate but as agents of moral instruction, whose gifts and punishments encourage reflection, self-awareness, and growth, a concept central to Greek mythology and its broader cultural philosophy that human virtue is tested by the challenges of life and the choices we make in pursuit of our desires. Midas' tale also serves as a metaphor for the perils of obsession in any form, suggesting that the pursuit of any single goal to the exclusion of balance, empathy, and foresight can lead to personal ruin, and that even the most seemingly desirable abilities may harbor hidden consequences if wielded without wisdom, a lesson that resonates as much today as it did in ancient times. As we explore the life and legend of King Midas, Part 2 deepens our understanding of the human cost of ambition and the transformative potential of awareness and repentance, revealing how suffering can lead to insight, how mistakes can catalyze growth, and how the pursuit of true happiness requires prioritizing love, humility, and connection over material accumulation, a lesson embedded in every interaction. every decision, and every consequence of Midas' golden touch, making his story a timeless reflection on the complexity of desire, the nature of fulfillment, and the enduring quest for wisdom in a world that often tempts us with the glitter of immediate rewards. After the ordeal of the golden touch and the painful lessons it imposed, King Midas emerged a changed ruler, wiser and more measured in his desires, a man who had learned firsthand the limitations of wealth and the irreplaceable value of human connection, and though the glittering treasures of his palace remained, they no longer defined him, for he had discovered that true richness lay not in possessions but in wisdom, moderation, and the bonds he shared with his people and family. Midas turned his attention to governing Phrygia with a new perspective, striving to balance prosperity with fairness, and his reign became marked not by mere accumulation of gold but by initiatives that promoted justice, trade, and cultural flourishing, reflecting the lessons he had learned from divine intervention and personal suffering. He encouraged artisans, philosophers, and musicians to settle in his kingdom, offering patronage that enriched not only the economy but also the intellectual and cultural life of his people, realizing that the legacy of a ruler is measured not in the weight of his treasury but in the enrichment of society, the cultivation of knowledge, and the welfare of his subjects. Stories of his folly and eventual enlightenment spread far beyond the borders of Phrygia, and Midas became a figure of both caution and inspiration, his legend a testament to the transformative power of reflection and repentance, reminding rulers and commoners alike that even great kings are vulnerable to the corrupting influence of unchecked desire and that redemption is possible through humility and ethical governance. Over time, Midas came to embody the duality of human ambition, the capacity to err grievously when blinded by greed, and the capacity to grow and adapt when confronted with the consequences of those errors, a theme that resonated deeply in Greek thought, where myths often served as moral and philosophical guides for understanding human nature and the delicate balance between mortal aspiration and divine oversight. In literature, drama, and art, Midas' story evolved into a rich allegory, illustrating the perils of avarice and the rewards of prudence, inspiring countless works that depicted him in moments of despair and enlightenment, from classical frescoes to medieval manuscripts and modern retellings, each emphasizing either the glittering tragedy of the golden touch or the redemption of a wise ruler who learned to value what truly matters. The psychological depth of Midas' journey also invites reflection on universal human experiences, the yearning for more than one has, the consequences of decisions made in pursuit of desire, and the transformative insight that comes from suffering, all of which render the myth not merely a story of ancient kings and gods but a mirror for contemporary audiences contemplating their own priorities, ambitions, and values. Scholars of mythology note that the story's enduring relevance stems from its ability to address both external and internal conflicts, portraying not only a king confronted by divine power but also the internal struggle between avarice and conscience, between immediate gratification and long-term well-being, and between the superficial allure of wealth and the enduring significance of ethical action and emotional fulfillment. Midas' legacy extended beyond moral instruction. Geographically, the river Pactolus became a symbol of the intersection between human endeavor and natural abundance, its golden sands a reminder that the consequences of our actions often leave tangible marks on the world, and culturally, his tale influenced the ways societies conceptualized wealth, power, and the responsibility that comes with privilege, echoing through proverbs, literature, and philosophical discourse for centuries. Moreover, Midas' story highlights the role of divine-human interaction in shaping human destiny, a recurring motif in Greek mythology that underscores the idea that mortals are subject to forces beyond their control but also possess the capacity for learning, adaptation, and ethical choice, illustrating a balance between fate and free will that has fascinated thinkers from antiquity to the modern era. In examining the life of Midas after his golden touch, one sees a king who, humbled by experience, channels his energies into constructive endeavors, fostering alliances, trade, and cultural growth, while also teaching the next generation the importance of temperance, compassion, and the understanding that the true measure of a ruler's greatness lies not in his treasures but in the welfare and flourishing of his people. By the end of his life, Midas' legend was firmly established not only as a tale of caution but also as a story of redemption, a narrative demonstrating that even the gravest mistakes can lead to insight, that suffering can catalyze moral growth, and that the pursuit of wisdom, empathy, and measured ambition provides a far richer reward than any amount of gold. The myth of King Midas continues to captivate because it combines drama, moral teaching, and psychological realism, portraying a human journey that begins with hubris, moves through punishment and grief, and concludes with understanding, a trajectory that reflects the timeless human struggle to reconcile desire with responsibility, indulgence with ethical awareness, and ambition with the deeper needs of the heart. In this way, Midas' tale transcends its mythological setting, offering lessons that remain relevant today, that the relentless pursuit of wealth or power without regard for consequence leads to isolation and sorrow, that repentance and humility can restore harmony, and that the most meaningful treasures are found not in material possession but in love, wisdom, and the enrichment of life itself, values that ensure the story of King Midas endures as a beacon of ethical reflection, human complexity, and the enduring appeal of myth across generations. The story of King Midas extends far beyond the borders of ancient Phrygia and the confines of his personal experience, becoming a cultural touchstone that has influenced art, literature, philosophy, and even modern storytelling, a testament to the enduring power of myth to convey universal truths across centuries and civilizations. From ancient Greek pottery depicting the tragic moment Midas embraced his golden daughter to Roman mosaics illustrating his golden touch, artists have long been captivated by the dramatic visual possibilities of transformation, the contrast between human warmth and lifeless wealth, and the emotional depth that emerges when desire clashes with consequence, creating powerful imagery that communicates both caution and fascination. Philosophers and moralists have also drawn upon Midas' tale to explore the nature of human greed, the ethical limits of ambition, and the distinction between needs and excess, often citing the myth as an allegorical example of how the pursuit of material wealth can erode moral judgment, distort priorities, and ultimately undermine happiness. A lesson as relevant in contemporary societies driven by consumption and competition as it was in the ancient world. Literary retellings of Midas' story abound, from classical Greek and Roman narratives to medieval morality tales and Renaissance dramas, each iteration emphasizing different facets of the myth. Some dwell on the consequences of unchecked desire, others celebrate the possibility of repentance and growth, and still others focus on the interplay between human folly and divine intervention, highlighting the rich interpretive flexibility that has allowed the tale to endure and resonate across different cultures and eras. Beyond literature and art, Midas' legend has been integrated into proverbs, aphorisms, and expressions in multiple languages, with references to a Midas touch entering the vernacular as shorthand for exceptional skill, success, or wealth-generating ability. A linguistic legacy that demonstrates the myth's lasting influence on how societies conceptualize achievement and the double-edged nature of extraordinary ability. The philosophical significance of Midas' story is further amplified by its exploration of desire and human limitation, presenting a narrative in which the very thing one covets most becomes a source of suffering, a paradox that invites reflection on the human condition, the consequences of choices, and the ethical imperative to temper ambition with wisdom, empathy, and foresight, concepts central not only to Greek thought but to ethical frameworks around the world. Scholars have also noted that Midas' experience functions as a meditation on the role of external power in shaping internal character, as the gift of the golden touch forces the king to confront the consequences of his impulses, the fragility of human relationships, and the ultimate futility of valuing wealth over love, a theme that resonates in contemporary psychology, economics, and moral philosophy, underscoring the timelessness of the narrative. The myth has inspired countless adaptations in modern media, from novels and plays to animated films, television series, and even video games, each exploring the tension between desire, consequence, and morality, demonstrating that Midas' story continues to provide fertile ground for creative expression and ethical inquiry, bridging ancient mythology with contemporary cultural imagination. The enduring fascination with Midas also lies in the symbolic richness of the tale. Gold itself serves as both a literal and metaphorical measure of value, a representation of human aspiration, temptation, and the seductive allure of permanence in a world defined by impermanence, a motif that resonates in economic theory, spiritual reflection, and artistic symbolism alike. Educational and moral discussions often employ Midas as a teaching tool, illustrating the principles of moderation, the importance of foresight, and the relational dimension of human flourishing, emphasizing that ethical leadership, emotional intelligence, and a balanced pursuit of goals outweigh the mere acquisition of material wealth, a principle that holds profound relevance in personal development and societal governance. Interestingly, the The myth also invites reflection on environmental and social consequences, as the transformation of natural and human elements into gold metaphorically suggests the potential destructiveness of prioritizing material gain over ecological sustainability, social bonds, and communal well-being, adding layers of interpretation that extend beyond personal morality to the collective responsibilities of rulers, societies, and humanity at large. Moreover, the enduring image of Midas serves as a lens through which to examine the interplay between human desire and divine or systemic forces, illustrating the broader cultural and spiritual understanding that gifts, power, and wealth often carry responsibilities and unforeseen consequences, a lesson emphasized repeatedly in mythologies worldwide and echoed in modern narratives addressing the ethical use of technology, capital, and influence. Ultimately, the legacy of King Midas lies in its capacity to bridge human experience with mythic insight, offering not just a cautionary tale but a story of transformation, redemption, and understanding, a narrative that invites each generation to reflect on the delicate balance between ambition and compassion, desire and wisdom, accumulation and fulfillment, and the pursuit of treasures that truly enrich the human soul rather than merely adorn it. As we examine the cultural, philosophical, and ethical reverberations of Midas' story, Part 4 of this series highlights the ways in which an ancient myth continues to inform modern thought, inspire creative expression, and provoke introspection, reminding us that the lessons of history, mythology, and human experience are interconnected, that the glitter of gold cannot replace the warmth of love and the richness of ethical action, and that King Midas' journey, from obsession and folly to enlightenment and moral growth, remains a shining example of the enduring power of myth to illuminate the human condition across time, space, and imagination. As we reach the conclusion of King Midas' tale, it becomes clear that his story is far more than a simple myth about wealth and desire. It is a timeless meditation on human nature, the consequences of our choices, and the pursuit of true fulfillment, lessons that have echoed through centuries of literature, philosophy, and cultural expression, reminding us that the glitter of gold cannot replace the warmth of love, wisdom, or human connection. After the harrowing experience of turning everything he touched into gold and the resulting isolation from the people and loved ones he cherished, Midas spent the remainder of his life with a profound awareness of moderation, humility, and the values that matter beyond material accumulation, ruling Phrygia not as a king obsessed with treasure but as a wise and reflective leader who understood that the wealth of the heart surpasses the wealth of gold. His experience became a cornerstone of moral reflection, a narrative illustrating that human desire, when left unchecked, can lead to suffering, and that redemption and learning are possible only when one recognizes the limits of one's ambition, the necessity of ethical consideration, and the importance of prioritizing relationships and moral responsibility over personal gain. Over time, Midas' story inspired countless generations, becoming a vehicle through which societies explored the dangers of greed, the ethical dimensions of power, and the role of divine or systemic forces in human affairs, a myth that operates on multiple levels, offering both dramatic entertainment and profound philosophical insight, and allowing each retelling to reflect the cultural, historical, and moral concerns of the time. In the visual arts, Midas' legend has provided a wealth of imagery, from ancient vases showing the instant of transformation to Renaissance paintings depicting the sorrow of a father unable to embrace his golden daughter, each interpretation highlighting the tension between desire and consequence, the beauty and peril of gold, and the emotional depth of human suffering and enlightenment, a testament to the story's enduring narrative power. Literary treatments of Midas, ranging from classical epics to modern fiction and poetry, continue to explore the interplay of desire, consequence, and moral reflection, often emphasizing the psychological dimensions of his journey, the shift from obsession to awareness, from selfishness to empathy, and from hubris to humility, illustrating the universal relevance of the tale to personal growth and ethical reasoning, and the ways myth can serve as both mirror and guide for human behavior. The phrase, Midas' touch, has entered everyday language as shorthand for extraordinary ability, success, or fortune, but the deeper moral resonance reminds us that the same gift that brings great advantage can also bring unintended harm, and that the responsible exercise of talent, influence, and resources requires reflection, foresight, and ethical consideration, lessons that remain as vital in contemporary life as they were in the ancient world. Beyond individual ethics, Midas' story also carries societal and philosophical significance, reflecting ancient Greek ideas about the relationship between humans and the divine, the moral responsibilities of leadership, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. while simultaneously offering a symbolic exploration of human desire, the allure of permanence, and the transitory nature of worldly wealth, providing layers of meaning that continue to inspire scholarly inquiry and artistic interpretation. The transformation of the river Pactolus, which carried the gold from Midas' body into its sands, symbolizes the broader impact of personal choices on the world, suggesting that actions driven by greed or ambition leave lasting traces, and conversely, that redemption and ethical transformation can also generate enduring positive effects, a metaphor that resonates in discussions of legacy, stewardship, and the responsibilities inherent in human creativity and influence. Reflecting on Midas' life after the Golden Touch, we see a king who integrates the lessons of suffering into his rule, fostering prosperity without excess, encouraging cultural and intellectual development, and cultivating compassion alongside material wealth, demonstrating that human growth often emerges most profoundly from hardship, that mistakes can catalyze insight, and that the greatest legacies are built not on treasure but on wisdom, empathy, and meaningful human connections. For modern audiences, the tale of King Midas remains both entertaining and instructive, a reminder that desires, ambitions, and talents must be tempered with reflection, that the pursuit of external rewards without ethical or emotional awareness carries significant risks, and that the true measures of a fulfilled life lie in love, generosity, understanding, and the capacity to balance aspiration with moderation. In conclusion, King Midas' legend endures because it speaks to core aspects of the human experience: the tension between desire and consequence, the journey from ignorance to awareness, the possibility of repentance and growth, and the enduring recognition that while wealth, power, and skill may dazzle and tempt, the treasures that truly enrich life are those that nurture the heart, sustain relationships, and foster wisdom. A timeless message that continues to captivate, instruct, and inspire audiences across generations and cultures. Thus, as we close this series on, we are reminded that myths like Midas are more than stories. They are reflections of our own struggles, ambitions, and choices, guiding us to consider what we value most, to act with foresight and compassion, and to remember that the most enduring gold is the kind found in understanding, humility, and love, lessons that will shine as brightly for us as any treasure ever could in the hands of a king. Even after the lessons of the Golden Touch and the restoration of his daughter, King Midas' story did not end with simple redemption. The remainder of his life became a period of reflection, introspection, and the careful cultivation of wisdom that would define his legacy for generations, a phase in which he sought to reconcile the desires that had once brought him so much pain with the responsibilities of rulership and the broader understanding of human values beyond wealth. Midas spent his days engaging with scholars, philosophers, and sages who traveled to Phrygia, eager to learn from a king who had personally experienced the extremes of fortune and the perils of unchecked desire, and through these interactions, he developed a philosophy of moderation, understanding, and stewardship, one that emphasized the ethical exercise of power and the cultivation of virtues that outlast material wealth. He encouraged the growth of arts and culture within his kingdom, funding the construction of theaters, libraries, and spaces where knowledge and creativity could flourish, understanding that true prosperity encompasses not only coins and jewels but the enrichment of minds, hearts, and society itself, a lesson rooted in the profound realization that human flourishing cannot be measured solely by material accumulation. Tales of Midas' earlier folly became cautionary stories told throughout Phrygia and neighboring lands, not merely as entertainment but as moral guidance, reminding future rulers and citizens of the dangers of avarice, the unpredictability of divine favor, and the need to temper ambition with empathy, prudence, and self-awareness, thereby embedding the story deeply into cultural consciousness and ethical discourse. Even as he aged, Midas remained vigilant against the temptations that had once nearly destroyed him, practicing restraint and encouraging his court and subjects to value community, love, and the ethical use of resources, ensuring that Phrygia's prosperity was balanced with justice and social cohesion, and demonstrating that the true mark of greatness is not found in the hoarding of treasure but in the cultivation of a kingdom where people can thrive in harmony and dignity. Beyond the material and political, Midas also reflected on the symbolic lessons of his experience, pondering how human desire often blinds individuals to the consequences of their actions and how wealth, while alluring, is transient and incapable of sustaining genuine happiness, an understanding that led him to embrace a philosophy emphasizing inner richness over external accumulation, moderation over excess, and relationships over possessions, a perspective that resonates with philosophical traditions across cultures and eras. The story of Midas' golden touch, and the subsequent transformation of the river Pactolus, became emblematic not only of human folly but also of the enduring traces of human action, suggesting that while mistakes may have lasting effects, they can also leave behind knowledge, wisdom, and cultural treasures that benefit others, a concept that has influenced interpretations of history, literature, and morality for centuries, inspiring reflection on the broader impact of personal decisions. In later accounts, poets and historians emphasized Midas' transformation from a king consumed by greed to a ruler guided by wisdom, highlighting his journey as a narrative of growth, ethical development, and the reconciliation of human desire with moral responsibility, showing that even the most flawed individuals can find redemption through understanding, self-awareness, and deliberate change, a universal theme that continues to captivate audiences. The enduring fascination with Midas also stems from the tension between his human vulnerability and the extraordinary circumstances he faced, demonstrating that myths serve not only as stories of gods and kings but as mirrors for human experience, reflecting the struggles, triumphs, and failures that define life, and offering lessons that remain relevant to anyone navigating the complexities of desire, ambition, and ethical choice. Modern retellings and adaptations of Midas' life continue to explore these themes, portraying him as a complex character whose narrative encompasses both tragedy and enlightenment, warning and inspiration, a figure whose journey resonates in discussions of leadership, personal growth, and the moral dimensions of human action, proving that myth can illuminate ethical and psychological truths across centuries. Additionally, Midas' story has influenced contemporary discourse on wealth, success, and fulfillment, inspiring the concept that extraordinary talent or opportunity must be tempered by judgment, foresight, and responsibility, and that the consequences of unrestrained desire extend beyond personal loss to affect communities, relationships, and the natural world, a lesson as relevant in modern society as in the ancient myth. Reflecting on Part 6 of his story, we see that King Midas' life, beyond its dramatic and legendary moments, illustrates the transformative potential of adversity, the importance of learning from mistakes, and the enduring human capacity for growth, empathy, and ethical leadership, showing that wealth, while alluring, is ultimately a tool that must be guided by moral understanding and a deep recognition of human interconnectedness. In sum, Midas' later years and legacy reveal a figure whose journey from obsession to enlightenment provides timeless insight, that happiness and fulfillment are not found in the glitter of gold but in the cultivation of wisdom, the care of others, and the balance of desire with ethical consciousness, ensuring that the myth of King Midas endures not only as a tale of caution but as a profound exploration of human nature, moral responsibility, and the enduring quest for meaningful life lessons that continue to shine for every generation that encounters the story of the king who learned that the truest treasures are those that cannot be touched or weighed, but are felt, shared, and remembered. The legend of King Midas has not remained confined to the annals of ancient mythology. It continues to resonate profoundly in modern culture, psychology, and literature, serving as both a cautionary tale and a metaphor for human ambition, success, and the unintended consequences of desire, demonstrating that the story's themes are timeless and universally applicable. In contemporary literature, filmmakers, and television, Midas often symbolizes the duality of extraordinary power, portraying characters whose remarkable abilities, talents, or opportunities come with unexpected consequences, reminding audiences that the pursuit of wealth, status, or influence, if unchecked, can lead to isolation, ethical compromise, and personal tragedy, just as it did for the ancient Phrygian king. In psychology, the Midas complex has been invoked to describe the paradoxical nature of human desire. The very objects or goals we strive for most passionately can bring suffering if we lack balance, foresight, or emotional intelligence, a concept explored in studies of greed, overambition, and obsessive behavior, emphasizing that the pursuit of external rewards alone rarely leads to lasting satisfaction or well-being. Pop culture has repeatedly drawn upon Midas' story in music, film, animation, and literature, from children's cartoons portraying the comedic and tragic elements of the Golden Touch to adult-oriented novels and television dramas exploring the moral and philosophical ramifications of excessive desire, demonstrating the narrative's flexibility and enduring relevance across genres, audiences, and media formats. The phrase, Midas touch, has become an idiom recognized worldwide, often used to describe individuals who excel effortlessly in business, finance, or creative endeavors, yet the myth's deeper meaning warns that exceptional skill or success without ethical grounding can lead to harm, isolation, or unintended consequences, a nuance that is frequently explored in literature, psychology, and business ethics alike. Philosophers and ethicists often use the Midas story to illustrate the interplay between temptation, moral choice, and responsibility, highlighting how desire, when pursued without reflection or moderation, can erode judgment, relationships, and fulfillment, and how wisdom, humility, and ethical consideration are necessary to navigate the challenges of opportunity, power, and ambition, lessons as relevant in the modern workplace as in the ancient world. Beyond its ethical dimensions, Midas' legend has inspired metaphorical and symbolic interpretations across the arts, from paintings depicting the tragic transformation of objects to poetry and literature emphasizing the emotional and relational consequences of obsessive ambition, showing that the myth continues to offer rich material for creative and reflective exploration, whether as a dramatic narrative, an allegorical device, or a source of philosophical inquiry. Economists and cultural critics have also noted the relevance of Midas in discussions of wealth distribution, capitalism, and materialism, using the story as a lens to examine how excessive accumulation, greed, and the untempered pursuit of profit can impact communities, society, and the natural environment, thereby connecting an ancient myth to contemporary concerns about ethics, sustainability, and social responsibility. In modern psychology, the tale is often framed as a study of human motivation and consequence, highlighting the tension between immediate gratification and long-term fulfillment, showing that the relentless pursuit of goals without consideration for broader impacts, whether on oneself, loved ones, or society, can result in profound regret, mirroring Midas' anguish when his desires destroyed what he valued most. Literary adaptations frequently explore the emotional depth of Midas' experience, emphasizing the isolation, despair, and eventual self-awareness that arise from unchecked ambition, transforming the myth from a simple story about wealth into a nuanced narrative about personal growth, moral responsibility, and the complex interplay between desire and consequence, insights that remain highly relevant in contemporary storytelling and ethical reflection. Midas' story also offers a framework for analyzing the psychological and emotional consequences of success, fame, and privilege, illustrating how extraordinary abilities or opportunities can alienate individuals from ordinary human experiences if not tempered by empathy, foresight, and relational awareness, a perspective echoed in modern leadership studies, behavioral psychology, and cultural criticism. Furthermore, the myth continues to inform educational narratives, moral instruction, and storytelling, emphasizing that lessons from ancient tales remain vital in shaping ethical awareness, personal development, and cultural literacy, and that the symbolic resonance of Midas' golden touch offers an enduring reminder that wealth, power, and skill must always be balanced with compassion, humility, and wisdom. Even in modern media such as films, video games, and animation, creators reinterpret Midas as a figure whose experience warns against obsession, hubris, and material fixation, while also exploring the redemptive possibilities of reflection, learning, and ethical growth, proving that the myth's themes transcend time, culture, and medium, and continue to inspire new generations. Ultimately, Part 7 of the King Midas series underscores the continuing cultural, psychological, and ethical significance of the myth. It reminds us that desire and ambition, when pursued without wisdom, can yield suffering, that extraordinary abilities come with responsibility, and that true wealth lies not in material accumulation but in relationships, moral insight, and the richness of human experience, ensuring that the story of King Midas remains a timeless parable, a mirror of human aspiration, and a guide for navigating the complex interplay between desire, consequence, and fulfillment across every era. In this way, the legend continues to shine as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, showing that while gold may glitter, the enduring treasures of life are found in understanding, empathy, and the ethical pursuit of one's goals, lessons that resonate as strongly today as they did in the ancient world, securing King Midas' place as a myth that transcends time, culture, and imagination, illuminating the human condition with every retelling. Part 8 of King Midas' story delves further into the enduring resonance of his legend, exploring how the myth functions as both a mirror to human behavior and a timeless lesson about the consequences of unchecked desire, illustrating that the implications of Midas' golden touch extend far beyond his kingdom and era, affecting culture, philosophy, and the collective imagination for millennia. Even centuries after his reign, the tale of Midas has remained a focal point for discussions about the nature of wealth, the ethics of ambition, and the psychological ramifications of obsession, offering insights into how human beings navigate the tension between aspiration and restraint, success and satisfaction, and power and moral responsibility. Philosophers have often cited Midas as an archetype of human folly, demonstrating that the pursuit of material abundance without consideration for its effects on relationships, society, or personal well-being inevitably leads to suffering, while simultaneously showing that recognition of one's errors and the capacity for self-reflection can transform failure into wisdom, a lesson central to both ethical discourse and personal development. In literature and drama, Midas' narrative has been reinterpreted across cultures to highlight diverse moral and psychological themes, from medieval morality plays that portrayed him as a cautionary figure warning against greed, to modern novels and adaptations that explore the complex emotions of regret, guilt, and redemption, emphasizing that human desire is not inherently negative but must be balanced with insight, empathy, and responsibility. In artistic representations, the moment of Midas' golden touch and the transformation of his daughter has been a particularly powerful motif, illustrating the tension between human longing and divine consequence, the beauty and terror of gold, and the emotional depth of parental love, grief, and realization, a scene that continues to captivate painters, sculptors, and illustrators as it combines visual spectacle with profound ethical and emotional significance. Beyond art and literature, Midas' story has found resonance in contemporary psychology, where it serves as a metaphor for obsessive behavior, the pitfalls of untempered ambition, and the unintended consequences of desires pursued without foresight or self-regulation, reminding individuals that the pursuit of success or material gain must be tempered with ethical consideration and awareness of relational and personal impact, echoing the ancient moral lessons of the myth in a modern context. In economics, business studies, and leadership discourse, the Midas touch is frequently invoked as both an aspirational and cautionary symbol, representing the dual potential of extraordinary ability to generate success while also illustrating the dangers of overreach, poor judgment, or neglect of ethical constraints, demonstrating how the ancient myth continues to inform practical and theoretical understandings of wealth, influence, and responsibility. The river Pactolus, whose sands were said to have been imbued with gold from Midas' curse, symbolizes the enduring consequences of actions, illustrating that even when personal suffering is overcome, the effects of choices leave tangible and lasting impacts on the environment, society, and culture, a theme that resonates in discussions of historical legacy, sustainability, and ethical stewardship, linking mythic narrative to real-world reflection. Furthermore, Midas' story provides a profound exploration of human psychology, showing that the longing for what we do not possess can blind us to what truly matters, and that insight, humility, and reflection are essential for transforming desire into wisdom, a concept echoed in philosophical, spiritual, and educational contexts throughout history, and one that continues to inform modern approaches to ethics, personal growth, and leadership. In popular culture, the story of King Midas has been adapted for audiences of all ages, from animated films and children's books to television dramas and adult novels, each version highlighting different dimensions of the myth, whether its comedic, tragic, or moralistic aspects, demonstrating the narrative's versatility and enduring appeal, and ensuring that Midas lessons continue to reach new generations in accessible and engaging ways. Midas' tale also functions as a symbolic reflection on human relationships, emphasizing that wealth and material success cannot substitute for love, empathy, and connection, and that the neglect of these values in pursuit of self-interest leads to profound loss, a lesson as relevant today as it was in ancient Phrygia, reminding us that human fulfillment is measured not by accumulation but by ethical conduct and relational depth. Educational systems and storytelling traditions continue to use Midas as a teaching tool, illustrating the dangers of obsession, the importance of foresight, and the transformative power of repentance and ethical reflection, showing that mythic narratives serve not only as cultural entertainment but as enduring frameworks for moral reasoning, emotional intelligence, and ethical education across societies. Finally, Part 8 of the Midas King series emphasizes that the legacy of King Midas is not limited to cautionary lessons but also celebrates the human capacity for growth, redemption, and wisdom, showing that even the gravest errors can be transformed into enduring insight, that suffering can lead to reflection and maturity, and that the pursuit of knowledge, compassion, and ethical conduct creates a richness far more profound than any material treasure, ensuring that the story of Midas remains a Timeless parable of desire, consequence, and the enduring quest for meaning, a myth that continues to inspire, educate, and illuminate the human experience across time, culture, and imagination. Part 9 of the King Midas series turns inward, examining the myth as a deeply human story of self-recognition and moral awakening, revealing how the legend endures not merely because of its dramatic elements but because it captures a universal psychological journey that transcends time, culture, and circumstance. At its core, the story of Midas is not about gold itself but about the human tendency to equate worth with possession, success with accumulation, and happiness with external validation, a pattern that repeats itself endlessly across history and remains strikingly familiar in the modern world. Midas' wish represents the moment when desire overrides wisdom, when imagination focuses solely on reward and ignores consequence, illustrating how ambition, when disconnected from reflection, can distort perception and blind individuals to the fragile networks of relationships, responsibilities, and values that sustain meaningful life. In this sense, Midas is not merely a king of ancient Phrygia but a symbolic figure representing every individual who has ever pursued success without considering its cost, every society that has prioritized wealth over well-being, and every leader who has mistaken power for fulfillment. The golden touch, so dazzling and seemingly miraculous, functions as a metaphor for excess itself, revealing that when desire becomes absolute, it transforms from a source of motivation into a force of destruction, turning nourishment into poison, connection into isolation, and love into loss. As Midas discovers that food cannot sustain him and affection cannot survive his touch, the myth exposes a profound truth, that human beings are not designed to thrive on material gain alone, and that the deepest forms of suffering arise when emotional, ethical, and relational needs are neglected in favor of external rewards. The emotional climax of the story, the loss of his daughter, underscores the devastating consequences of misplaced values, illustrating how obsession not only harms the self but ripples outward to destroy what is most precious, a lesson that resonates deeply in narratives of familial breakdown, moral compromise, and societal imbalance throughout history. Yet the power of the Midas myth lies not only in its warning but in its insistence on the possibility of transformation, for Midas is not condemned eternally to his error but is offered the opportunity to recognize his folly, seek forgiveness, and change his path, emphasizing a core ethical principle of Greek mythology, that suffering, when met with humility and awareness, can lead to wisdom rather than despair. His cleansing in the river Pactolus symbolizes more than the removal of a curse, it represents the act of letting go, of releasing the illusion that control, wealth, or power can secure happiness, and of returning to a state of balance where life regains its warmth, unpredictability, and meaning. This moment of purification transforms Midas from a cautionary figure into a reflective one, showing that the acknowledgement of limitation is not weakness but the foundation of ethical maturity and genuine fulfillment. In later interpretations, Midas becomes emblematic of the human struggle to reconcile desire with responsibility, illustrating that ambition itself is not inherently destructive, but that it must be guided by wisdom, empathy, and an awareness of consequence to become constructive rather than corrosive. The myth thus speaks directly to modern anxieties surrounding success, productivity, and consumption, offering a symbolic critique of cultures that celebrate accumulation while neglecting emotional well-being, ethical responsibility, and communal care. In psychology, this inward reading of the Midas story aligns with understandings of obsession and burnout, showing how the relentless pursuit of achievement can hollow out the very experiences that give life meaning, leading to isolation, regret, and a loss of identity, outcomes vividly embodied in the king who possessed infinite wealth yet could not eat, embrace, or live. In education and moral philosophy, Midas' journey is often presented as a case study in value formation, encouraging reflection on how priorities are shaped, how desires are disciplined, and how individuals can learn to distinguish between what dazzles and what endures. The enduring appeal of the myth lies in its honesty. It does not deny the attraction of gold, power, or success, but it exposes their insufficiency when pursued as ultimate ends, reminding audiences that fulfillment arises from balance rather than excess, from connection rather than control, and from wisdom rather than possession. As Part 9 reveals, the story of King Midas survives because it evolves with each generation, offering new layers of meaning while preserving its central truth, that human beings must learn, often painfully, that not everything that shines is worth touching, and that the most valuable treasures are those that cannot be owned, measured, or turned to gold. In this way, the legend continues to function as a living narrative, inviting reflection on personal choices, societal values, and the enduring human quest for meaning, ensuring that the story of King Midas remains not only a myth of the past but a mirror held up to the present, reflecting the eternal struggle between desire and wisdom that defines the human condition. Part 10 of the King Midas series broadens the lens once more, presenting the myth as a timeless framework through which civilizations have examined power, responsibility, and the ethical limits of human desire, revealing why this ancient story continues to feel strikingly modern in every era that retells it. As societies evolved from agrarian kingdoms to industrial and digital economies, the symbolic meaning of Midas' golden touch expanded, transforming from a literal curse into a metaphor for unchecked expansion, overproduction, and the relentless pursuit of growth without regard for consequence, echoing the same moral tension that lay at the heart of Midas' original wish. In this sense, Midas becomes a prophetic figure, embodying the dangers of valuing output over outcome, accumulation over sustainability, and profit over human and environmental well-being, a narrative pattern that has repeated itself throughout history whenever ambition outpaced wisdom. The myth illustrates how power, when divorced from restraint, alters perception itself, as Midas initially sees gold as a universal solution, only to discover that the same force that multiplies wealth can simultaneously erode life's essential foundations, turning nourishment into emptiness and abundance into isolation. This duality has made Midas a central reference point in philosophical debates about the ethics of power, where his story is often used to illustrate that capability without moral guidance inevitably leads to self-destruction, regardless of how noble or exciting the original intention may appear. In political and leadership theory, Midas represents the ruler who mistakes control for competence, believing that absolute authority or limitless resources will secure stability and legacy, only to learn that leadership divorced from empathy and accountability creates fragility rather than strength, a lesson echoed in the rise and fall of empires across centuries. The golden touch also functions as a warning about systems that prioritize efficiency and expansion at the expense of human dignity, illustrating how mechanisms designed to generate value can become destructive when they override the basic needs of connection, care, and meaning. In modern cultural analysis, Midas is frequently invoked in discussions of consumerism, where the endless conversion of experience, labor, and nature into commodities mirrors the king's transformation of living reality into inert gold, highlighting how obsession with ownership can drain life of vitality and reduce richness to mere appearance. The myth's emotional power lies in its insistence that suffering is not accidental but instructive, positioning pain as a teacher that reveals the limits of desire and forces a reckoning with neglected values, a perspective deeply rooted in Greek thought and still influential in contemporary philosophy and psychology. Midas' repentance and release from the curse underscore the idea that wisdom is born not from perfection but from error recognized and corrected, suggesting that ethical growth requires vulnerability, humility, and the courage to abandon illusions of control. The river Pactolus, carrying away the remnants of his golden touch, symbolizes the restoration of balance, reminding audiences that renewal often demands surrender rather than conquest, and that letting go can be more powerful than acquisition. Across literature and art, later reinterpretations of Midas have emphasized this moment of release as the true climax of the story, shifting the focus from punishment to insight, and from spectacle to meaning, reinforcing the notion that transformation begins when desire yields to understanding. In contemporary storytelling, Midas often appears as an archetype in narratives about technological power, financial dominance, or creative genius, where characters who can turn anything into success confront the unintended costs of their abilities, demonstrating that progress without ethical reflection replicates the same tragic pattern encoded in the ancient myth. The persistence of the Midas story across cultures reveals a shared human anxiety about excess, the fear that abundance might hollow out purpose rather than fulfill it, and the recognition that the most dangerous losses are not material but emotional, relational, and moral. In educational contexts, the myth continues to serve as a foundational lesson in value discernment, encouraging individuals to ask not only what they want, but what their desires might destroy if left unchecked, a question that remains essential in a world defined by unprecedented access, speed, and power. As Part 10 shows, King Midas endures because his story articulates a paradox at the heart of human aspiration, that the same drive which builds civilizations can also unravel them if not guided by wisdom, empathy, and restraint. His journey reminds us that success is not measured by how much we can transform into wealth, influence, or recognition, but by how well we preserve what makes life worth living in the first place. Ultimately, the myth affirms that meaning arises not from domination or accumulation, but from balance, responsibility, and the ability to recognize when enough is truly enough, a lesson that continues to resonate as humanity navigates the challenges of modern power, ambition, and desire. In this way, Part 10 reinforces King Midas as more than a mythic king. He becomes a timeless symbol of humanity's struggle to master its own appetites, urging each generation to reflect on the cost of its dreams and to remember that the brightest gold often conceals the deepest emptiness when wisdom is left behind. Part 11 of the King Midas series explores the myth as a meditation on identity and self-worth, revealing how the pursuit of external validation can gradually replace inner understanding, and how the tragedy of Midas is rooted not only in greed but in a deeper confusion about what defines value, success, and meaning in a human life. Before the golden touch, Midas already possessed wealth, power, and admiration, yet his longing for more suggests an inner emptiness, a quiet dissatisfaction that material abundance could not silence, reflecting a universal human struggle to seek fulfillment outside oneself rather than cultivating insight, gratitude, and balance within. The wish for gold was not merely a desire for riches but an attempt to solidify worth, to make value tangible and permanent, revealing how fear of loss, insecurity, and the impermanence of life often drive individuals to cling to symbols of control and status. In this sense, the golden touch becomes a distorted form of identity, transforming Midas from a living, relational being into a mechanism of conversion, someone who no longer interacts with the world but processes it, turning experience into possession and connection into commodity, a powerful metaphor for how people can lose themselves when success becomes the sole measure of identity. As the curse unfolds, Midas' isolation deepens, not because he lacks people or power, but because his touch erases intimacy, demonstrating that identity built on acquisition cannot sustain relationships, empathy, or shared humanity, and that the self becomes hollow when defined only by output, ownership, or achievement. The loss of his daughter represents the ultimate collapse of this false identity, confronting Midas with the devastating realization that the very standard by which he measured worth has destroyed the relationship that gave his life meaning, forcing a reckoning between who he believed he was and who he had become through his choices. This moment reveals one of the myth's most profound insights, that identity anchored in possession inevitably collapses under the weight of its own success, leaving behind regret, grief, and a longing for what cannot be recovered through wealth or power. When Midas seeks forgiveness and release, his transformation is not simply the removal of a curse but the redefinition of self, a movement away from external validation toward inner clarity, humility, and relational awareness, showing that redemption begins when individuals relinquish the illusion that worth can be accumulated or secured through control. The washing away of the golden touch symbolizes a return to vulnerability, to the acceptance of limits, and to the recognition that identity is shaped through relationships, responsibility, and moral choice rather than dominance over the material world. In later philosophical readings, Midas is often interpreted as an early exploration of existential themes, illustrating how meaning is not discovered through excess but through alignment between values and action, and how suffering exposes the fractures between who we are and who we pretend to be. The myth anticipates modern psychological insights about burnout, alienation, and the cost of performance-based identity, where individuals become trapped in cycles of achievement that erode joy, connection, and self-understanding, echoing Midas' transformation into a king who could own everything but belong nowhere. In leadership and cultural discourse, this aspect of the myth highlights the danger of systems that reward output without regard for human cost, showing how identities built around productivity, dominance, or success can fracture communities and individuals alike, and why ethical frameworks must address not only outcomes but the inner lives of those who wield power. Midas' later life, as depicted in reflective traditions, suggests a gradual rebuilding of identity rooted in wisdom rather than wealth, where the king learns to see himself not as a converter of value but as a steward of people, culture, and responsibility, illustrating that true authority arises from understanding limits rather than transcending them. The enduring relevance of this interpretation lies in its honesty, acknowledging that the desire to be exceptional, secure, and admired is deeply human, but warning that when these desires become substitutes for self-worth, they corrode the foundations of fulfillment and belonging. Part 11 thus reframes the myth of King Midas as a story not only about greed but about the fragile construction of identity, showing how the pursuit of external validation can sever individuals from meaning, and how restoration requires the courage to redefine success on humane, ethical, and relational terms. The story endures because it speaks to a truth that remains unresolved in every age, that human beings must continually choose whether to measure themselves by what they possess or by how they live, love, and take responsibility for the impact of their desires. In this way, King Midas stands as a timeless reflection of the human struggle to ground identity in wisdom rather than illusion, reminding each generation that the most dangerous transformation is not turning the world into gold, but turning the self into something incapable of connection, humility, and growth. A lesson that remains as urgent today as it was in the ancient telling of a king who learned too late that value cannot be touched, owned, or weighed, but must be lived. King Midas, Greek legend, series shifts the focus toward wisdom earned through loss, examining how memory, regret, and moral awareness reshape a life after illusion has been stripped away, presenting Midas not as a cautionary figure frozen in his failure but as a human being forced to live with the long shadow of his choices. After the golden touch is washed away, the world does not instantly return to harmony, because consequences linger beyond the removal of a curse, and Midas must confront the emotional residue of what he has done, learning that forgiveness from the gods does not erase accountability within the self. The king's palace, once a symbol of excess and power, now feels hollow, its splendor reminding him of a time when he mistook abundance for fulfillment, and each glittering surface reflects not pride but memory, turning wealth into a mirror that reveals the cost of unchecked desire. In this phase of the myth, Midas becomes a quieter figure, less certain, more observant, embodying the transformation from a ruler who commanded the world to one who listens to it, illustrating how suffering often dismantles arrogance and replaces certainty with contemplation. His regret is not portrayed as theatrical despair but as a steady, enduring awareness, a recognition that some losses can be honored but never undone, and that wisdom often arrives too late to prevent harm yet early enough to prevent repetition. The story suggests that true punishment is not divine wrath but remembrance, the inability to forget what was nearly destroyed, and the responsibility to live differently because of it. Midas' relationship with nature changes profoundly, as fields, rivers, and trees are no longer resources to be controlled but companions in humility, each harvest reminding him that life thrives through balance rather than domination, and that prosperity arises from cooperation with the world rather than conquest of it. This reconnection with the natural order reflects an ancient Greek understanding of harmony, where human excess disrupts cosmic balance, and restoration requires restraint, reverence, and alignment with forces greater than individual ambition. Philosophically, Part 12 emphasizes that wisdom is not knowledge gained through instruction but understanding forged through experience, particularly through failure, positioning Midas as a figure who embodies the painful education of consequence. His silence becomes meaningful, showing that growth often expresses itself not through proclamation but through changed behavior, and that humility is less about self-denial than about accurate self-perception. In later retellings, Midas is sometimes depicted as a patron of art and music rather than gold, symbolizing a redirection of value toward creativity, beauty, and expression, suggesting that once material obsession fades, the human spirit seeks meaning in shared culture and imagination. This transition reinforces the idea that fulfillment is relational and expressive, not accumulative, and that the arts offer a form of immortality rooted in influence rather than possession. The myth also explores how leadership evolves through suffering, presenting a king who governs with caution, empathy, and restraint, understanding that power without wisdom breeds destruction, and that authority must be guided by ethical awareness rather than personal desire. Midas' governance becomes an extension of his inner reform, showing how personal transformation can ripple outward, reshaping institutions, traditions, and social priorities. Yet the story does not idealize redemption as perfection, acknowledging that doubt and memory continue to accompany him, reminding audiences that growth does not erase pain but integrates it into a more conscious way of living. This realism gives the myth its enduring strength, rejecting simplistic moral resolutions in favor of nuanced reflection on how people live after their illusions collapse. In a broader cultural sense, Part 12 frames the legend as an exploration of post-crisis identity, addressing what remains when ambition fails and excess loses its allure, a question that resonates across eras marked by material pursuit and moral reckoning. Midas becomes a symbol of humanity's capacity to learn from error, not by denying desire but by understanding its limits, and by recognizing that longing must be guided by wisdom to avoid self-destruction. The myth suggests that the greatest legacy is not the avoidance of mistakes but the willingness to change because of them, and that maturity arises when individuals accept responsibility without surrendering hope. As the narrative settles into reflection rather than drama, it leaves audiences with a quiet but powerful insight that life after illusion may be humbler, slower, and less dazzling, but it is also more real, more connected, and more sustainable. Part 12 thus deepens the story of King Midas into a meditation on how wisdom grows from remembrance, how leadership matures through humility, and how the human soul finds meaning not in turning the world into gold, but in learning how to live gently within it, aware that value is preserved not by grasping harder, but by holding less and understanding more. Part 13 of the King Midas, Greek Legend series turns toward the theme of judgment and perception, revealing how even after transformation and humility, the human mind remains vulnerable to error, desire, and misjudgment, and how wisdom must be continually practiced rather than assumed to be permanent. In this phase of the legend, Midas is no longer defined by greed but by discernment, or rather by the ongoing challenge of learning how to judge value without falling back into illusion. The story traditionally places him amid a divine contest between Apollo and Pan, a moment that tests not wealth or power but taste, perception, and inner alignment, showing that the struggle for wisdom does not end with one great failure but unfolds through many quieter trials. When Pan's rustic music competes with Apollo's refined harmony, the contest becomes symbolic rather than technical, representing the tension between instinct and order, immediacy and discipline, raw pleasure and cultivated balance. Midas, asked to judge, chooses Pan, not out of greed but from a lingering attachment to simplicity and sensation, revealing that even a reformed soul can mistake preference for truth and comfort for excellence. This decision demonstrates that humility does not automatically grant clarity, and that personal inclination can still distort judgment when it is mistaken for universal value. Apollo's response, transforming Midas' ears into those of a donkey, is not an act of cruelty but a symbolic exposure, turning an inner misalignment into a visible truth, and reminding both Midas and the audience that errors of perception carry consequences even when intentions are sincere. The donkey ears represent the gap between self-image and reality, illustrating how individuals often believe they have achieved wisdom while remaining partially blind to their own biases and limitations. Unlike the golden touch, this punishment is not destructive but revealing, forcing Midas to confront embarrassment, vulnerability, and the fear of social judgment, and shifting the myth's focus from material consequence to psychological and social consequence. Midas attempts to hide the ears beneath a cap, symbolizing the human tendency to conceal flaws rather than address them, and suggesting that shame, rather than greed, now becomes his primary obstacle to growth. The secret eventually escapes through the whispering reeds, illustrating the mythic idea that truth resists suppression and that hidden misalignments inevitably surface, whether through rumor, nature, or unintended confession. This episode reframes wisdom as transparency rather than control, implying that growth requires acknowledging imperfection rather than disguising it. Philosophically, Part 13 emphasizes that judgment is an ethical act, not merely a personal opinion, and that choosing poorly, even in matters of taste, can reveal deeper disconnections between values and understanding. The story suggests that wisdom is not the absence of error but the ability to recognize, learn from, and integrate it without retreating into denial or pride. Midas' response to this humiliation marks a critical stage in his evolution, as he no longer seeks to undo the punishment through bargains or appeals, but endures it, accepting exposure as a necessary part of self-knowledge. This acceptance contrasts sharply with his earlier desperation to escape the golden touch, showing that he has learned the difference between harmful suffering and instructive discomfort. In broader cultural terms, the myth critiques leaders and judges who mistake personal taste for universal truth, warning that authority without self-awareness can distort standards and undermine harmony. Midas becomes a symbol of the fallibility of human judgment, even when guided by good intentions, and of the need for continual reflection, dialogue, and humility in decision-making. The Donkey Ears episode also highlights the social dimension of wisdom, showing that growth occurs not in isolation but within the gaze of others, and that accountability often arrives through community response rather than divine decree. By allowing the truth to be known, even indirectly, the myth suggests that authenticity, though uncomfortable, restores balance between inner reality and outward life. As Part 13 unfolds, the legend deepens its portrayal of Midas as a complex figure who embodies the ongoing tension between learning and error, transformation and relapse, insight and blind spot. The story refuses to present wisdom as a final state, instead portraying it as a fragile practice requiring vigilance, honesty, and openness to correction. In this way, King Midas becomes less a symbol of failure and more a mirror of the human condition, reflecting how individuals grow not by achieving perfection, but by repeatedly confronting their limitations with courage and awareness. Part 13 thus expands the myth beyond moral instruction into a meditation on judgment itself, reminding audiences that the greatest danger lies not in making mistakes, but in believing oneself immune to them, and that true wisdom emerges when individuals accept exposure, listen deeply, and allow even their misjudgments to refine rather than define them. King Midas, Greek legend, series brings the narrative into its final philosophical arc, exploring acceptance, legacy, and the quiet integration of wisdom into daily life, showing that the ultimate resolution of Midas' story is not marked by dramatic reversal but by a sustained transformation of character. Having endured loss, humiliation, and exposure, Midas no longer seeks to define himself through singular moments of triumph or failure, but through consistency, restraint, and attentiveness, suggesting that maturity arises when identity is no longer reactive but grounded. The donkey ears, once symbols of ridicule and error, gradually lose their power over him, not because they vanish, but because Midas ceases to organize his life around hiding or correcting them, demonstrating that acceptance dissolves shame more effectively than resistance. This stage of the myth emphasizes that wisdom is not achieved through erasing flaws but through integrating them into a broader understanding of self, where imperfections become reminders rather than sources of self-contempt. Midas' leadership reflects this internal shift, as he governs without spectacle, focusing on fairness, sustainability, and the well-being of his people rather than personal glory, illustrating how ethical authority emerges from self-awareness rather than dominance. The kingdom itself changes in tone rather than wealth, becoming a place where moderation is valued, where excess is viewed with caution, and where prosperity is measured by stability and trust rather than accumulation. In this environment, Midas functions less as a heroic figure and more as a steward, aligning with Greek ideals of balance and harmony that warn against extremes in all things. Philosophically, Part 14 frames the myth as a meditation on legacy, asking what remains after ambition fades and reputation fluctuates, and suggesting that the truest legacy is not material inheritance but cultural memory shaped by conduct, restraint, and example. Midas' story becomes a lesson passed quietly rather than proclaimed loudly, influencing future generations not through monuments of gold but through narratives of caution and growth, showing how stories themselves become vessels of wisdom. The myth implies that the gods no longer intervene because Midas no longer demands correction through excess, having internalized the principles that once required divine enforcement, a subtle indication that moral maturity reduces the need for external punishment. His relationship with art and music deepens, not as a judge but as a listener, reflecting his learned respect for forms of excellence that surpass personal preference and demand humility before mastery. This shift highlights one of the myth's core conclusions, that wisdom involves recognizing excellence without needing to possess or control it, allowing beauty to exist independently of ego. Midas' private life also settles into simplicity, emphasizing routine, reflection, and connection rather than spectacle, suggesting that fulfillment often emerges in ordinary moments rather than extraordinary achievements. The absence of dramatic resolution reinforces the story's realism, portraying growth as an ongoing condition rather than a climactic event, and reminding audiences that the most meaningful transformations are often the least visible. In a broader cultural interpretation, Part 14 resonates as a commentary on aging, power, and the relinquishment of illusion, reflecting how individuals and societies must eventually confront the limits of ambition and redefine success in humane terms. The myth suggests that peace arises not from having escaped error but from having learned to live honestly with it, integrating past failures into a coherent and ethical present. As the narrative reaches its closing movement, King Midas stands not as a warning frozen in mythic punishment, but as a portrait of a flawed human being who learned, slowly and painfully, how to align desire with responsibility. The enduring power of the legend lies in this evolution, transforming a simple moral tale into a layered exploration of how wisdom matures through experience, humility, and acceptance. Part 14 thus concludes the series by reaffirming that the true resolution of the Midas story is not the removal of curses or the approval of gods, but the cultivation of a life guided by restraint, empathy, and awareness, a life that honors value without trying to seize it, and that understands fulfillment not as domination over the world, but as harmony within it. King Midas, Greek Legend series serves as the reflective epilogue of the myth, drawing together its moral, philosophical, and human threads into a final meditation on choice, awareness, and the quiet dignity of a life lived with understanding. At this stage, King Midas is no longer defined by singular symbols such as gold or donkey ears, but by an inner posture shaped through years of consequence, learning, and restraint, showing that the true end of transformation is not correction but coherence. His earlier desires, once loud and consuming, now exist only as memories, reminders of a time when he confused intensity with meaning and possession with purpose. The myth suggests that wisdom does not erase desire but places it in proportion, allowing longing to exist without governing action, and ambition to motivate without corrupting judgment. Midas' final portrayal emphasizes attentiveness, the capacity to pause before choosing, and the discipline of reflection, illustrating that the most valuable skill gained through suffering is the ability to foresee the weight of one's decisions before they unfold. His kingdom reflects this internal clarity, functioning not as a realm of spectacle or excess, but as a stable and quietly prosperous society where trust outweighs fear and continuity outweighs conquest. The absence of dramatic divine intervention in this final phase underscores the myth's deepest conclusion, that maturity is reached when external forces are no longer required to correct internal imbalance, and when ethical awareness becomes self-sustaining. Midas' relationship with wealth is transformed into one of distance rather than rejection, recognizing material resources as tools rather than measures of worth, and this balanced stance reflects the Greek ideal of sophrosyne, moderation as the foundation of a good life. In philosophical terms, Part 15 presents Midas as a figure who has reconciled illusion with reality, accepting that human life is defined not by perfection but by continuous adjustment between desire and responsibility. His story now functions less as a warning and more as a guide, offering insight into how error can refine rather than destroy character when met with honesty and humility. The legend implies that what grants Midas peace is not forgiveness alone, but understanding, a deep awareness of how his inner states shape outer outcomes, and how unchecked longing can distort even noble intentions. Memory remains present, but it no longer wounds, serving instead as a quiet compass that keeps him aligned with restraint and empathy. The myth subtly suggests that this integration of memory is what distinguishes wisdom from regret, as regret clings to what cannot be changed, while wisdom uses the past to inform the present without being trapped by it. In cultural reflection, Part 15 speaks to societies as much as individuals, reminding audiences that prosperity without ethical grounding leads to fragility, and that lasting stability arises from moderation, accountability, and respect for limits. Midas becomes a symbol of civilization's capacity to learn from excess, illustrating that decline is not inevitable if reflection follows failure and restraint replaces arrogance. The story's final tone is intentionally quiet, resisting heroic closure in favor of sustained balance, emphasizing that the most enduring victories are internal and often invisible. As the legend settles into silence, King Midas stands not as a tragic caution or redeemed hero, but as a fully human figure who learned to live within the boundaries of reality without resentment, fear, or illusion. The endurance of his story lies in this final state, where wisdom is not proclaimed but practiced, and where value is honored without being seized. Part 15 thus completes the journey of King Midas by affirming that the true gold of life is awareness itself, the ability to recognize what matters before it is lost, and the courage to choose restraint over excess, meaning over possession, and harmony over domination, a lesson that continues to resonate because it speaks not to an ancient king alone, but to the timeless human struggle to live wisely in a world filled with temptation, power, and desire. King Midas, Greek Legend series extends beyond the conclusion of the myth into its afterlife, exploring how stories endure, transform, and continue to shape human understanding long after their characters have faded into legend, suggesting that the final meaning of Midas' journey lies not in his personal fate but in the way his experience is remembered, retold, and reinterpreted across generations. In this reflective continuation, King Midas exists less as a historical figure and more as a symbolic presence, a narrative echo that adapts to the concerns of each era, revealing how myths function as living frameworks rather than fixed lessons. The golden touch, once a literal curse, becomes a metaphor endlessly reapplied to new forms of excess, whether economic greed, technological obsession, or the relentless pursuit of status, demonstrating that the myth's power lies in its flexibility and relevance. Midas' story is invoked whenever societies confront the paradox of abundance without satisfaction, reminding audiences that progress without wisdom can accelerate destruction rather than fulfillment. In this sense, Part 16 positions the legend as a cultural mirror, reflecting not only ancient anxieties but modern ones, where accumulation often outpaces meaning and speed replaces reflection. The endurance of the Midas myth illustrates how storytelling preserves ethical insight more effectively than instruction alone, embedding caution within narrative emotion rather than abstract rule. As listeners and readers encounter the story, they are invited not to judge Midas from a distance, but to recognize elements of themselves within his desires, mistakes, and gradual awakening, reinforcing the myth's role as a tool for self-examination rather than moral condemnation. The series suggests that what truly survives is not the image of a king turning objects into gold, but the emotional recognition of loss when value is misunderstood, a recognition that transcends time, culture, and circumstance. Philosophically, Part 16 emphasizes that myths endure because they address unresolved human tensions, such as the conflict between desire and restraint, freedom and responsibility, ambition and belonging, tensions that no single era can permanently resolve. King Midas becomes a shared language through which societies articulate these struggles, adapting his image to new contexts while preserving the core insight that unchecked desire carries unintended consequences. The legend's persistence in art, literature, and popular culture reflects humanity's need to revisit foundational questions about worth and fulfillment, especially during periods of rapid change or material expansion. In educational and cultural traditions, Midas functions as an entry point into broader ethical conversations, demonstrating how personal choices ripple outward into social, environmental, and relational consequences. The story's simplicity allows it to reach across age groups, while its depth invites lifelong reinterpretation, making it both accessible and inexhaustible. Part 16 also reflects on the responsibility of storytelling itself, suggesting that how a story is told shapes what lessons are emphasized, whether caution, empathy, irony, or hope. By tracing Midas' evolution rather than freezing him at his moment of failure, the series argues for narratives that allow growth, complexity, and redemption, resisting the temptation to reduce individuals to their worst decisions. This approach aligns with a humane philosophy that recognizes error as an essential component of learning rather than a permanent mark of identity. In this way, the myth of King Midas becomes an argument for compassion without complacency, accountability without despair, and wisdom without rigidity. The final insight of Part 16 lies in the recognition that myths do not end, they circulate, adapt, and return whenever human behavior echoes their themes, ensuring that King Midas remains present wherever value is misunderstood or desire overwhelms judgment. His story reminds audiences that the most dangerous transformations are often invisible, occurring not when the world changes, but when perception narrows and meaning is reduced to possession or control. By surviving in collective memory, the legend fulfills its ultimate purpose, not to warn once, but to remind repeatedly, across centuries, cultures, and crises. Part 16 thus closes the extended journey of the Midas series by affirming that the true legacy of the myth is its capacity to remain unfinished, inviting each generation to complete it anew through reflection, choice, and restraint. In this enduring openness, King Midas ceases to belong to the past and becomes a companion to the present, a quiet voice within human culture that asks the same essential question again and again, not what can be gained, but what must be understood before it is too late. King Midas, Greek legend, series turns inward, examining the myth as an ethical mirror for the individual conscience, and asking how the lessons of Midas persist not only in culture but within personal decision-making, where the quietest choices often carry the greatest moral weight. At this stage, the legend is no longer centered on events or transformations, but on interpretation, on how listeners internalize the story and allow it to shape their understanding of desire, responsibility, and self-control. King Midas becomes a symbolic presence within the human mind, representing the moment when temptation appears reasonable, even justified, and when the consequences of excess are not immediately visible. The myth suggests that the most dangerous wishes are those that align perfectly with existing values, because they bypass skepticism and feel like logical extensions of ambition, much as Midas' wish for gold seemed consistent with his role as a successful king. This inward framing reveals how ethical failure often begins not with malice, but with unexamined assumptions about what constitutes success, safety, or happiness. The story encourages reflection on how individuals justify their desires, how they rationalize trade-offs, and how easily short-term gain can obscure long-term cost. In this sense, Part 17 reframes the golden touch as a psychological phenomenon, the tendency to evaluate experiences primarily through utility or advantage, gradually eroding empathy and presence. When everything becomes a means to an end, relationships, creativity, and even self-understanding are reduced to instruments, echoing Midas' transformation of the world into objects of value rather than sources of meaning. The myth challenges this mindset by illustrating how such reduction ultimately impoverishes the inner life, leaving abundance without fulfillment and control without peace. Part 17 also explores the role of restraint as an internal discipline rather than an imposed rule, emphasizing that ethical living depends on the capacity to pause, question impulse, and tolerate uncertainty without immediately seeking resolution through acquisition or dominance. Midas' journey demonstrates that restraint is not weakness but foresight, the ability to imagine consequences beyond immediate desire. This lesson resonates deeply in modern contexts where speed, convenience, and optimization are prized, often at the expense of reflection and care. The legend invites individuals to examine where they may be living with their own version of the golden touch, where success is pursued so relentlessly that it begins to strip experiences of depth and connection. Philosophically, Part 17 suggests that conscience is not a static moral code but an evolving awareness shaped by memory, empathy, and imagination. Midas' growth reflects the development of conscience through lived consequence, showing how ethical understanding matures when abstract values collide with real outcomes. The myth implies that wisdom arises when individuals allow themselves to feel the full weight of their choices rather than escaping into justification or denial. This willingness to remain present with discomfort becomes the foundation of moral clarity, enabling individuals to align desire with responsibility over time. In this inward reading, the donkey ears episode symbolizes the exposure of self-deception, the moment when private misjudgments become undeniable, and when humility must replace defensiveness if growth is to continue. The story suggests that self-knowledge often arrives through embarrassment or error, and that resisting these experiences only delays understanding. By accepting exposure, Midas models an ethical posture that values truth over pride, an approach that allows conscience to deepen rather than harden. Part 17 ultimately positions the Midas myth as a tool for self-inquiry, encouraging individuals to ask not what they want most, but why they want it, and what they are willing to risk or sacrifice to obtain it. The enduring relevance of the story lies in this capacity to provoke honest questioning, to interrupt automatic desire with reflective awareness. As the series moves further from narrative and closer to philosophy, King Midas becomes less a character and more a lens through which human motivation is examined, revealing the subtle ways in which desire shapes perception, judgment, and behavior. The myth's power endures because it does not provide simple answers, but invites continuous vigilance, reminding audiences that ethical living is not achieved once and for all, but practiced daily through attention, restraint, and care. Part 17 thus deepens the legend into an intimate conversation with the self, affirming that the greatest test of wisdom occurs not in extraordinary circumstances, but in ordinary choices where desire whispers quietly, consequences remain unseen, and conscience must speak without certainty, guided only by the lessons of memory, empathy, and the enduring echo of a king who once wished the world into gold. King Midas, Greek legend, series widens its perspective once more, situating the myth within the shared fabric of human experience and collective responsibility, and exploring how the lessons of Midas extend beyond individual conscience into the ethical life of communities, economies, and civilizations. At this stage, the story functions less as a personal parable and more as a social warning, illustrating how collective desire, when amplified by systems of power and reward, can reproduce the same dynamics of excess and blindness that once defined a single king. The golden touch becomes a metaphor for structures that prioritize accumulation, efficiency, and growth above all else, transforming land, labor, and relationships into abstract units of value, and gradually disconnecting societies from the human and ecological costs of their success. The myth suggests that what begins as prosperity can evolve into fragility when balance is sacrificed, echoing Midas' realization that abundance without wisdom creates isolation rather than security. In this reading, the tragedy of Midas is not an anomaly but a pattern, one that re-emerges whenever communities fail to question the assumptions driving their ambitions. Part 18 emphasizes that myths endure because they illuminate recurring errors, offering a language through which societies can critique themselves without collapsing into cynicism or blame. King Midas becomes a symbolic ancestor of modern dilemmas, his wish reflecting the collective impulse to convert complexity into measurable gain, and to mistake growth for well-being. The story invites reflection on how systems normalize behavior that would appear destructive at an individual level, allowing harm to unfold gradually and invisibly until consequences become unavoidable. Just as Midas did not foresee the full cost of his wish, societies often fail to anticipate how unchecked incentives reshape values, erode trust, and strain the bonds that sustain communal life. Philosophically, Part 18 explores the tension between collective benefit and individual responsibility, suggesting that ethical societies require not only just rules but cultivated judgment among those who participate in them. The myth implies that no system can compensate for the absence of restraint, empathy, and foresight at the human level, and that structural reform must be accompanied by moral awareness to avoid reproducing the same patterns of excess under new forms. In this sense, Midas' journey becomes a call for civic humility, a reminder that power, whether held by a king or a corporation, magnifies both wisdom and error. The legend also highlights the importance of narrative in shaping collective values, showing how stories influence what societies admire, reward, and normalize. By preserving the memory of Midas' failure and growth, culture creates a counterweight to narratives that glorify limitless success, offering instead a cautionary balance that affirms moderation and care. Part 18 suggests that when societies lose touch with such narratives, they risk repeating the same mistakes without recognizing them as errors, mistaking warning signs for progress. The myth's relevance to environmental ethics becomes particularly clear in this context, as the golden touch mirrors extractive relationships with the natural world, where immediate gain obscures long-term damage. Midas' eventual reconnection with nature symbolizes the possibility of restoration, but also underscores the cost of delay, reminding audiences that repair is often more difficult than restraint. The story thus frames sustainability not as a technical challenge alone, but as a moral one, rooted in how value is defined and desire is governed. As Part 18 unfolds, the legend of King Midas evolves into a shared ethical inheritance, one that challenges communities to examine the stories they live by and the assumptions they rarely question. The myth does not demand rejection of ambition or prosperity, but insists on their alignment with responsibility, empathy, and awareness of limits. In this broader view, King Midas stands as a reminder that civilizations, like individuals, are judged not by what they accumulate, but by how they treat what they depend upon. Part 18 thus reinforces the enduring power of the myth as a guide for collective self-examination, urging societies to listen carefully to the quiet lessons embedded in ancient stories, and to recognize that the most dangerous curse is not imposed from outside, but arises when shared desires go unexamined and unchecked. The legend endures because it speaks to this collective vulnerability, offering not certainty, but a mirror, and inviting each generation to decide whether it will repeat the wish, or learn from the one who made it first. King Midas, Greek legend, series moves toward a universal conclusion by examining the myth as a reflection on time, mortality, and the limits of human control, revealing how the deepest lesson of Midas is not about wealth or judgment alone, but about learning to live meaningfully within impermanence. At this stage, the story is fully detached from spectacle and punishment, instead lingering on the quiet truth that all power, possession, and achievement are temporary, and that the tragedy of Midas emerged from his attempt to deny this reality through permanence in gold. The golden touch represents a human desire to freeze value, to make what is fleeting endure forever, and the myth suggests that this desire, while understandable, conflicts with the natural rhythm of life, where change, decay, and renewal are essential to meaning. Midas' suffering exposes the paradox that what is most alive is also most fragile, and that attempts to preserve life by hardening it ultimately destroy the very qualities that make it worth preserving. In this reading, the myth becomes a meditation on mortality, reminding audiences that fear of loss often drives people to seek control, accumulation, or legacy, yet these strategies cannot eliminate impermanence, only distance individuals from authentic engagement with the present. Part 19 emphasizes that acceptance of time is central to wisdom, and that Midas' growth lies in recognizing that value arises not from permanence, but from participation in passing moments, relationships, and responsibilities. The story suggests that maturity involves shifting from the desire to secure life against loss to the courage to experience it fully despite uncertainty. Philosophically, this perspective aligns the myth with ancient Greek reflections on fate and measure, where hubris arises when humans attempt to transcend their limits rather than live skillfully within them. Midas' initial wish embodies this hubris, while his later restraint reflects a reconciliation with human finitude, illustrating that peace comes not from mastery over time, but from harmony with it. The myth also explores how memory functions as a bridge between permanence and impermanence, allowing experiences to endure without being possessed. Midas' story survives not because his gold remained, but because his error was remembered, transformed into meaning through narrative. This insight reinforces the idea that stories, not monuments, preserve human experience, and that wisdom is transmitted through reflection rather than accumulation. In cultural terms, Part 19 speaks to modern anxieties surrounding legacy, productivity, and the pressure to leave something lasting behind, questioning whether the pursuit of permanence often undermines the quality of the life being lived. The legend suggests that a life well lived may leave fewer tangible traces, yet resonate more deeply through influence, example, and memory. Midas' final portrayal is not one of triumph over death or time, but of reconciliation with them, accepting that significance does not require endless extension, but attentive presence within one's allotted span. The myth thus reframes success as alignment with reality rather than resistance to it, emphasizing that fulfillment emerges when desire is tempered by awareness of limits. Part 19 also reflects on how fear of impermanence shapes societies, driving cycles of expansion, preservation, and anxiety that mirror Midas' personal struggle on a collective scale. The story warns that civilizations, like individuals, risk spiritual impoverishment when they attempt to secure permanence through domination, extraction, or rigid control, instead of cultivating adaptability and care. In this sense, Midas becomes a timeless figure through whom humanity negotiates its relationship with time itself, continually returning to the same questions under new conditions. As the series approaches its final movement, Part 19 offers a quiet but profound resolution, suggesting that the ultimate wisdom of the Midas myth lies in learning how to let go without despair, to value without clinging, and to act meaningfully without demanding permanence. The legend endures because it affirms that while nothing can be held forever, understanding can deepen, relationships can matter, and choices can shape the quality of the present. Part 19 thus positions King Midas not as a symbol of failure, but as a guide toward a more honest engagement with time, mortality, and meaning, reminding audiences that life's true richness is found not in what can be preserved, but in what can be lived fully before it passes. King Midas, Greek legend, series serves as the final contemplative horizon of the myth, drawing together its long journey into a meditation on wisdom as a lifelong practice rather than a final achievement, and affirming that the enduring power of the story lies in its refusal to offer absolute closure. At this concluding stage, King Midas exists not as a character bound to narrative events, but as a symbol of human becoming, representing the truth that understanding unfolds gradually through attention, correction, and choice, rather than through singular revelations. The myth suggests that even after regret has softened ambition, after humility has replaced arrogance, and after restraint has tempered desire, the work of living wisely continues, requiring constant awareness of how easily old impulses can reappear in new forms. Midas' life, when viewed from this distance, is not defined by the moments of divine intervention, but by the countless ordinary decisions made afterward, decisions shaped by memory, empathy, and the hard-earned recognition of limits. This final perspective emphasizes that wisdom is not a state of purity or certainty, but a disciplined relationship with uncertainty itself, an ability to move forward without illusion while remaining open to meaning. The story ultimately reframes the question that haunted Midas from the beginning, shifting it from what one can gain to how one should live, and suggesting that this question has no permanent answer, only evolving responses shaped by experience and reflection. In philosophical terms, Part 20 aligns the myth with the idea that ethical life is procedural rather than possessive, something enacted repeatedly rather than owned, and that moral clarity arises from engagement rather than withdrawal. The golden touch, once a dramatic symbol of excess, fades into the background, replaced by a quieter awareness of how easily value can be distorted whenever attention drifts or desire becomes unchecked. The legend implies that the true danger is not temptation itself, but forgetfulness, the gradual erosion of insight when lessons are assumed to be complete rather than continually renewed. Midas' enduring relevance lies precisely in this vulnerability, reminding audiences that no amount of reflection permanently immunizes individuals or societies against error. The myth also affirms hope, however, by showing that awareness can be recovered, that restraint can be recozen, and that wisdom can deepen even after repeated missteps. In this way, King Midas becomes less a warning frozen in mythic time and more a companion through the human condition, walking alongside each generation as it confronts new forms of excess, power, and desire. The story suggests that meaning is not found in escaping these forces, but in learning how to engage them without surrendering judgment or compassion. Part 20 also reflects on the role of silence and listening in wisdom, contrasting the noise of ambition with the attentiveness that emerges after suffering has stripped away illusion. Midas' final posture is one of receptivity rather than assertion, illustrating that understanding often grows in spaces where control is relaxed and presence is prioritized. This emphasis resonates with the myth's ancient roots, echoing Greek ideals of measure and balance, while also speaking to modern lives shaped by speed, accumulation, and distraction. The conclusion of the series resists triumph or despair, choosing instead a tone of quiet continuity, suggesting that the most honest ending is one that mirrors life itself, unresolved yet meaningful. King Midas does not transcend his humanity, he inhabits it more fully, accepting that imperfection is not an obstacle to wisdom but its starting point. The legend's final lesson is therefore not prescriptive but invitational, encouraging audiences to recognize their own moments of grasping, judgment, and blindness without condemnation, and to respond with curiosity rather than denial. As the myth settles into collective memory, it leaves behind not a command, but a question that renews itself with each retelling: how will value be understood today, and what will be sacrificed if desire is allowed to decide alone? Part 20 completes the long arc of the Midas series by affirming that wisdom is not the absence of longing, but the art of living with it responsibly, attentively, and humanely. In this final reflection, King Midas stands as a timeless figure not because he overcame desire, but because he learned to live with awareness of its power, reminding every listener that the true gold of life is not what can be touched or kept, but the clarity with which one chooses, again and again, how to live within the limits of being human. King Midas, Greek legend, series extends the narrative beyond the personal and social consequences of Midas' life to examine the interplay between desire, transformation, and the natural world, reflecting on how human ambition and ethical awareness intersect with the rhythms of nature, time, and the cycles of growth and decay. At this stage, the myth positions Midas not only as a king or a moral figure, but as a symbolic participant in the broader ecosystem of life, demonstrating that choices made without regard for the environment, physical, social, or emotional, can generate cascading effects that extend far beyond immediate perception. The golden touch, once a literal curse, now functions as a metaphor for the ways in which excessive desire imposes itself on the natural flow of life, transforming what is living and dynamic into static, lifeless representations, and illustrating that the human impulse to control or possess can disrupt harmony in profound and lasting ways. Midas' reflections reveal that wisdom involves recognizing boundaries, understanding interdependence, and cultivating restraint not merely for personal or social benefit, but in acknowledgement of the delicate balances that sustain existence. The myth emphasizes that ethical insight arises from attentiveness to these relationships, suggesting that the most meaningful human growth occurs when individuals learn to act with awareness of the broader consequences of their actions, particularly upon elements of life that cannot be coerced, quantified, or dominated. Philosophically, Part 22 explores the tension between desire and limitation, portraying Midas' golden touch as a cautionary emblem of the human tendency to extract value without understanding context, and to substitute accumulation for true engagement with life. The story underscores that while wealth, power, or skill may temporarily amplify influence, they cannot replace attunement to the living world, nor can they guarantee fulfillment. Midas' later life demonstrates a sustained practice of observation, patience, and care, reflecting a shift from reactive consumption to conscious stewardship. This transformation illustrates that ethical and ecological intelligence are inseparable, as awareness of one's impact on the environment mirrors awareness of the social and emotional consequences of action. Part 22 also highlights the role of humility in maintaining balance, showing that growth emerges when individuals acknowledge their limits, listen to forces beyond their control, and accept that mastery over life is ultimately an illusion. The myth suggests that the integration of experience and observation forms the basis of durable wisdom, and that Midas' final state, attuned, reflective, and restrained, is a model not just for personal ethics, but for sustainable interaction with the world. Moreover, the legend reflects on cycles of loss and renewal, illustrating that mistakes, suffering, and exposure are not endpoints, but stages within ongoing processes of learning and adaptation. The story positions Midas as a symbol of resilience, highlighting how awareness, reflection, and ethical choice can transform past errors into constructive insight. Part 22 further explores how myth functions as a tool for transmitting ecological and moral awareness, allowing generations to internalize lessons about limits, care, and consequence through narrative rather than prescriptive instruction. The golden touch, now reframed, becomes a warning against imposing rigidity on systems that require flexibility, reminding audiences that attempts to seize or dominate inevitably meet resistance from the natural order. Socially, the myth extends these lessons into communal life, suggesting that sustainable societies depend on citizens who understand both the power and the restraint inherent in human influence, and who act with foresight, empathy, and moderation. Midas' story, in this context, functions as a mirror for civic consciousness, emphasizing that ethical behavior is relational, iterative, and embedded within networks of consequence. Part 22 also meditates on the enduring nature of myth itself, showing how stories persist because they encapsulate universal patterns of error, adaptation, and growth, and because they allow listeners to perceive connections between individual choices and broader systems. By framing Midas' journey in ecological, social, and temporal terms, the series underscores that wisdom is not abstract, but relational and contextual, arising from the ongoing negotiation between human desire and the constraints of life. In this way, the legend's final lesson is both expansive and intimate. Understanding emerges when individuals recognize the limits of control, honor interdependence, and allow reflection to guide action within the flows of life, rather than against them. Part 22 thus situates King Midas as a figure whose significance endures because it transcends gold, punishment, and even personal morality, extending into a timeless reflection on balance, care, and the responsibility inherent in every human choice, reminding audiences that the true measure of life lies not in possession, but in mindful participation in the world. King Midas, Greek legend, series brings the narrative into a deeper reflection on the nature of desire, identity, and transformation, exploring how Midas' journey illustrates the ongoing tension between the impulses that define human life and the wisdom that allows those impulses to be integrated into meaning rather than destruction. At this stage, the myth emphasizes that the trials of Midas were not simply external events imposed by divine forces, but reflections of internal struggles that all humans face, the tension between wanting and understanding, between possession and appreciation, and between ambition and humility. The golden touch, once a literal and catastrophic power, becomes a symbol of the ways in which unexamined desire can harden perception, turning dynamic relationships, creative work, and living experiences into static, unyielding objects, illustrating the danger of valuing things for their measurable or material qualities rather than their inherent significance. Midas' transformation from a man consumed by greed to a figure of measured reflection represents the process by which experience reshapes identity, showing that true growth arises not through avoidance of error, but through deliberate engagement with its consequences and the cultivation of discernment. Philosophically, Part 23 emphasizes that human identity is continually constructed through choices, that each action carries moral and relational weight, and that maturity emerges when individuals learn to act with awareness of the ripple effects of their desires. The myth highlights that unchecked longing, while natural, can distort priorities and compromise the capacity to perceive value where it truly exists, whether in human relationships, artistic expression, or the rhythms of the natural world. Midas' eventual wisdom is thus relational as well as personal, reflecting an understanding that ethical life is inseparable from attentiveness to others, including the environment, the community, and the self. The story also explores the temporality of consequence, showing that even when harm is done, reflection and restraint can redirect patterns of behavior, allowing for recovery, repair, and the cultivation of insight over time. In this sense, the golden touch becomes a metaphor for any form of excess, whether wealth, ambition, or desire, that, if left unchecked, alienates the individual from the living world, but which can also be transformed into a teacher when its lessons are faced with honesty and humility. Part 23 further meditates on the interplay between internal and external transformation, demonstrating that Midas' evolution was as much about reframing perception and recalibrating values as it was about mitigating outward effects. The legend emphasizes that ethical and psychological growth are intertwined, and that personal transformation inevitably reverberates through social, familial, and cultural contexts. By situating Midas within a continuum of learning, the story underscores that wisdom is not a final state, but an ongoing practice of reflection, restraint, and conscious choice, one that continues even after the immediate crises of youth or folly have passed. Moreover, the myth encourages recognition of the subtle ways in which desire and impulse shape daily life, suggesting that vigilance and self-awareness are necessary to prevent small, habitual choices from accumulating into patterns of harm. Midas' story also demonstrates that humility emerges through exposure, embarrassment, and the undeniable consequences of one's actions, highlighting the value of accepting truth rather than resisting it, and suggesting that growth is accelerated when humans confront their limitations directly rather than evading them. Part 23 expands the significance of the legend by connecting Midas' personal journey to universal human challenges: the pursuit of fulfillment, the negotiation of ambition, and the cultivation of ethical discernment. The myth presents these challenges as continuous, cyclical, and inescapable, reminding audiences that life's richness is inseparable from its complexity, and that growth requires ongoing attention rather than singular achievement. King Midas, in this phase, becomes an archetype not of failure or triumph, but of persistent human striving, a figure whose story reflects the ever-present tension between desire and insight, between the temptation to grasp and the discipline to observe, and between fleeting gratification and enduring meaning. Part 23 concludes with the recognition that the Golden Touch's true legacy is not measured in wealth, punishment, or spectacle, but in the lessons it imparts about balance, responsibility, and the cultivation of awareness, offering a timeless guide for navigating life's continuous interplay of longing, consequence, and understanding. In this way, the myth affirms that the human journey toward wisdom is perpetual, and that Midas' story endures because it mirrors the ongoing task of living attentively, ethically, and with a measured appreciation of the value inherent in all aspects of existence. King Midas, Greek legend, series shifts focus to the enduring dialogue between power, responsibility, and moral reflection, examining how the experiences of Midas illuminate the intricate ways in which humans negotiate authority, desire, and the ethical consequences of their actions. At this stage, the narrative moves beyond the literal events of Midas' life, presenting him as an archetypal figure whose journey embodies the tension between the pursuit of personal ambition and the need for measured judgment, demonstrating that true sovereignty involves more than dominion over wealth or land. It requires mastery of oneself. The Golden Touch, once a striking curse, becomes a symbolic lens through which the story interrogates the dangers inherent in the unrestrained use of influence, illustrating how every act of control carries with it the potential to distort relationships, warp priorities, and unintentionally harm those one seeks to govern or protect. Midas' reflections, long after the immediate drama of his wish, reveal the subtlety of consequence, the realization that ethical misjudgment does not always manifest as dramatic catastrophe, but often unfolds gradually, altering the texture of life in ways that are only perceptible through ongoing awareness and contemplation. Philosophically, Part 24 presents Midas' journey as an exploration of human accountability, suggesting that wisdom arises when one learns to anticipate the cascading effects of choices, to weigh desire against consequence, and to act in ways that honor the interdependence of self, society, and the natural world. The myth demonstrates that power and influence are not inherently corrupting, but that they demand attentiveness, humility, and self-restraint to be exercised ethically. Failing these qualities, even the most well-intentioned ambition can produce unintended suffering. In this reading, the legend portrays Midas' evolution as both personal and emblematic, showing that individuals who cultivate reflective insight become capable of guiding others with discernment, whereas those who ignore the lessons of their own experience risk repeating the same errors through action or negligence. Part 24 also emphasizes the relational nature of wisdom, asserting that understanding is incomplete when pursued in isolation. Midas' growth is inseparable from his awareness of family, citizens, and the broader community, illustrating that ethical development is always embedded within networks of connection. The story explores the subtle dimensions of desire as well, suggesting that longing itself is not inherently flawed, but that it must be balanced by perspective, patience, and an appreciation of limits. The Golden Touch thus becomes a cautionary emblem not of ambition per se, but of the distortion that occurs when desire is prioritized over discernment and self-reflection. Moreover, the myth highlights the temporal aspect of moral learning. Insight rarely arrives instantly, and ethical clarity is often the product of accumulated experience, reflection on consequences, and the iterative practice of restraint. Midas' enduring relevance lies in his embodiment of this process, showing that human growth is dynamic and ongoing, responsive to circumstances, mistakes, and observation. Part 24 also situates the legend within a broader cultural and philosophical context, revealing how stories serve as repositories for collective wisdom, allowing societies to transmit guidance about ambition, power, and responsibility across generations. By framing Midas' story as a reflection on ethical engagement rather than merely a cautionary tale, the narrative invites audiences to consider their own capacities for self-examination, empathy, and measured action, and to recognize the ways in which personal choices ripple outward into social and environmental realms. The myth underscores that the exercise of influence is inseparable from ethical reflection, and that moral growth involves continually revisiting and recalibrating one's understanding of responsibility in light of new experiences and consequences. In this way, King Midas transcends his literal narrative, becoming a symbol of the ongoing human effort to integrate ambition, desire, and ethical awareness into coherent action. Part 24 thus concludes by emphasizing that the true legacy of Midas is not the golden touch itself, but the insights it generates about restraint, attentiveness, and moral courage, offering a timeless model for navigating the complexities of life, influence, and relational accountability. Through his story, audiences are reminded that the path to wisdom is continuous, that every choice carries weight beyond immediate perception, and that true understanding arises when power is tempered with reflection, desire is guided by perspective, and human action is aligned with enduring principles of care, fairness, and insight. In this enduring resonance, King Midas remains a figure not merely of legend, but of living relevance, teaching that the cultivation of ethical judgment is the most valuable treasure of all. King Midas, Greek Legend series continues the exploration of the myth by delving into the theme of transformation, not only in external circumstance but within the interior life, tracing how Midas' experiences illuminate the enduring human struggle to reconcile desire, consequence, and the search for meaning. By this stage, the story shifts from chronological events to reflection, considering how the lessons of the golden touch ripple across time, shaping understanding of self, relationships, and the world at large. Midas' initial greed and impulsive wish for gold serve as a lens through which the series examines the ways in which unexamined desires distort perception, prioritizing material gain over relational and experiential richness, and demonstrating how fixation on possession can harden the mind, obscure empathy, and isolate the individual from the living, dynamic world around them. The narrative emphasizes that the most profound transformation is rarely external, rather, it emerges through sustained attention, humility, and the willingness to confront one's errors and their repercussions. In this light, Midas' journey embodies the process of moral and psychological maturation, illustrating that wisdom arises not from the avoidance of misjudgment, but from engagement with its consequences, reflection upon them, and the disciplined cultivation of insight over time. Philosophically, Part 25 explores the tension between desire and restraint, showing that the ability to temper impulses is not a denial of life or ambition, but a means of integrating aspiration into a broader understanding of value, consequence, and relational responsibility. Midas' evolution highlights that human fulfillment is inseparable from attentiveness to the needs, well-being, and perspectives of others, and that ethical insight is inseparable from relational awareness. The golden touch, in this context, becomes a powerful metaphor for any force, internal or external, that threatens to distort judgment and flatten experience, emphasizing the importance of moderation, reflection, and attentiveness in shaping choices that are both meaningful and responsible. Part 25 also examines the temporal dimension of learning, suggesting that the repercussions of actions unfold over time, often in ways that are subtle and cumulative, requiring ongoing awareness and adjustment. Midas' story models this principle, showing that transformation is iterative, and that ethical, personal, and social growth are processes rather than fixed states. The legend further engages with the role of memory and storytelling in sustaining insight across generations, demonstrating that myths function as living repositories of human experience, encoding lessons about desire, consequence, and ethical judgment in ways that remain relevant regardless of historical context. By situating Midas' experience within these broader reflections, the narrative underscores that human life is a continuous negotiation between longing and understanding, ambition and care, action and reflection. Part 25 highlights the integration of internal and external transformation, showing that insight gained through reflection reshapes behavior, relationships, and influence, while simultaneously reinforcing the habit of attentive, ethical engagement in daily life. The story emphasizes that Midas' growth is neither linear nor complete, mirroring the ongoing nature of human striving, and suggesting that the pursuit of wisdom is perpetual, requiring vigilance, humility, and deliberate practice in every domain of existence. Moreover, the myth underscores the interplay between power and responsibility, illustrating that influence, whether over resources, people, or circumstances, is inseparable from ethical awareness, and that neglecting this interdependence invites harm, both subtle and profound. Midas' narrative demonstrates that the cultivation of character, judgment, and self-awareness constitutes the most enduring legacy, far surpassing transient material wealth or fleeting achievement. Part 25 also reflects on the symbolic resonance of Midas' reconciliation with the limits of his power, suggesting that the acceptance of constraint is not defeat, but a crucial step toward freedom, understanding, and meaningful engagement with life. In this sense, the Golden Touch evolves from a story of punishment into a meditation on mindfulness, intentionality, and the careful alignment of desire with principle. The myth conveys that the true measure of life is not the quantity of what is acquired, but the quality of attention, the depth of ethical discernment, and the capacity to act in ways that sustain both self and others. King Midas, in this final reflection, stands as a timeless figure whose experiences illuminate the human condition, reminding audiences that transformation, personal, relational, and moral, is continuous, that wisdom emerges from engagement with imperfection, and that the treasures of life are found not in possession, but in the disciplined cultivation of awareness, responsibility, and understanding. Part 25 closes the series by reaffirming the enduring relevance of the Midas myth, highlighting that its lessons about desire, consequence, and ethical growth remain applicable across time, offering a guide for navigating the complexities of human life with care, attention, and humility, and ensuring that the story's resonance continues to shape reflection, choice, and understanding for generations to come. King Midas, Greek legend, series deepens the exploration of human desire, reflection, and the nature of enduring wisdom, presenting King Midas as a figure whose journey illustrates the intricate balance between ambition and restraint, and the continuous process of ethical and personal development that defines meaningful life. At this stage, the story focuses on the ways in which Midas' experience with the Golden Touch extends beyond the literal and immediate consequences, functioning as a metaphor for the subtle, ongoing effects of choices, impulses, and attachments that shape the trajectory of an individual and ripple outward into broader social and natural contexts. The legend emphasizes that the desire for wealth, power, or recognition, while natural, becomes dangerous when divorced from reflection and responsibility, showing that unexamined longing can distort perception, isolate individuals from their communities, and impede the cultivation of empathy, insight, and enduring values. Midas' transformation, now understood as both inward and relational, illustrates that the path to wisdom is not sudden or complete, but iterative, shaped by continual observation, adjustment, and attention to consequence. Philosophically, Part 26 frames Midas' story as a meditation on the relational dynamics of life, suggesting that human flourishing depends not only on personal judgment, but on an ongoing awareness of how desires, actions, and decisions affect others, the environment, and the networks of connection that sustain meaningful existence. The Golden Touch becomes a symbolic reminder that attempts to dominate, possess, or control without ethical consideration inevitably produce unintended consequences, demonstrating that responsibility must accompany power to prevent harm and preserve balance. In this reading, the myth underscores that learning from error requires humility, patience, and reflection, and that transformation involves integrating insight into daily conduct, social engagement, and relationships with the natural world. Part 26 also emphasizes temporality, showing that the consequences of ambition unfold gradually and often imperceptibly, requiring vigilance and ethical attentiveness to recognize patterns of harm before they escalate. Midas' journey models this principle, illustrating that wisdom is cultivated through the recognition of cumulative effects, the practice of restraint, and the alignment of desire with principle rather than impulse. The story further explores the role of narrative memory in preserving lessons across generations, highlighting how myths function as vehicles for collective understanding, encoding guidance about ambition, moderation, and moral judgment that transcends the specifics of historical circumstance. In this sense, King Midas serves as both subject and teacher, his experiences offering insight into the challenges of human life while simultaneously providing a framework through which audiences can interpret their own struggles with desire, consequence, and ethical choice. Part 26 also reflects on the interplay between internal and external transformation, illustrating that personal growth reshapes interactions, influence, and social responsibility, and that ethical development is inseparable from relational awareness and care. The legend portrays the golden touch as an archetype for the forces, material, emotional, or social, that can harden perception, distract from meaningful engagement, and perpetuate harm, and demonstrates that only deliberate attention, reflection, and ethical practice can temper such forces and redirect them toward constructive ends. Moreover, the story underscores that insight is neither permanent nor automatic, but requires continual vigilance, humility, and the courage to confront lingering impulses, demonstrating that the cultivation of character is a lifelong endeavor. The myth situates Midas' growth within broader human and societal concerns, showing how awareness of consequence, restraint, and ethical responsibility contributes to the well-being of both individual and collective life, and suggesting that wisdom arises when personal desire is harmonized with care for others and the natural world. Part 26 culminates in the recognition that the true value of life is not measured in accumulation or possession, but in the discernment, attentiveness, and deliberate action that allow human beings to live in alignment with enduring principles of justice, care, and awareness. King Midas, in this reflection, becomes a symbol not of failure or triumph, but of the ongoing human effort to negotiate the tension between longing and insight, impulse and responsibility, acquisition and meaning. The story reinforces that transformation is continuous, that ethical engagement requires constant practice, and that the lessons of desire and consequence are timeless, offering guidance to every generation. In this way, Part 26 affirms that the Midas myth endures because it mirrors the perpetual human task of living attentively, ethically, and with understanding, showing that the richest treasures are not material, but lie in the cultivation of wisdom, self-awareness, and the thoughtful exercise of responsibility within a world of interconnection, impermanence, and possibility. King Midas, Greek legend, series deepens the reflective scope of the myth, emphasizing the intricate relationship between desire, learning, and the continuous shaping of character, positioning King Midas as a figure whose experiences illuminate the delicate balance between human ambition and ethical restraint. At this stage, the narrative moves beyond the dramatic consequences of the golden touch, focusing instead on the subtler, long-term transformations that arise from awareness, reflection, and the iterative process of correcting one's impulses. Midas' story serves as a meditation on how desires, whether for wealth, power, or recognition, can dominate perception, distort judgment, and alienate individuals from the relational and natural systems that sustain meaning, yet also how those same impulses can be refined into sources of insight and moral understanding when tempered by reflection and self-restraint. Philosophically, Part 27 presents Midas' evolution as emblematic of the human condition, illustrating that growth, wisdom, and fulfillment are products of continuous attention to consequence and responsibility, rather than singular acts of triumph or avoidance of error. The legend underscores that the golden touch, once a curse wrought by excessive desire, functions as a symbolic lens for examining the ways in which human actions reverberate through time and affect not only the self but the broader community, demonstrating that ethical awareness is inseparable from relational engagement. In this phase, the story emphasizes that moral insight is cultivated gradually, requiring reflection on past mistakes, attentive observation of ongoing consequences, and deliberate practice of restraint and empathy, illustrating that wisdom is iterative rather than instantaneous, and relational rather than isolated. Midas' experience highlights the tension between longing and limitation, showing that human desire, while natural, becomes harmful when it overrides judgment or compassion, and that the cultivation of ethical discernment requires vigilance, humility, and the courage to confront one's impulses honestly. Part 27 also explores the role of temporality, suggesting that consequences often unfold incrementally, and that awareness of cumulative effects is essential to responsible action. Midas' reflections demonstrate that the pursuit of lasting value, whether in relationships, governance, or personal achievement, requires alignment of desire with principle, as well as sustained attention to the interdependence of individuals, communities, and natural systems. The myth situates Midas' journey within a broader framework of cultural and philosophical significance, illustrating how storytelling functions as a medium for transmitting collective wisdom, encoding lessons about ambition, moderation, and ethical awareness that endure across time. The golden touch, as a metaphor, emphasizes the risks of rigid control and the importance of adaptability, showing that life's richness is not captured in accumulation, but experienced through attentive participation, relational awareness, and the careful exercise of judgment. Moreover, Part 27 underscores that internal transformation directly shapes external influence, as the development of insight, humility, and self-restraint informs decisions that affect family, society, and the natural world, reinforcing the interconnected nature of ethical living. The legend demonstrates that maturity is achieved not by eliminating desire, but by integrating it with reflection, perspective, and care, cultivating the capacity to act responsibly even amid uncertainty and temptation. Part 27 further meditates on the symbolic power of memory, suggesting that the enduring significance of Midas' story lies in its capacity to illuminate the processes by which human beings learn, adapt, and transmit wisdom, preserving insights about desire, consequence, and ethical living across generations. Through this lens, Midas becomes a timeless figure, not merely a cautionary character, but a guide to understanding the dynamic interplay between human ambition and moral discernment. The narrative conveys that transformation is continuous, that ethical growth requires deliberate attention to the cascading effects of action, and that the richest form of human achievement is the cultivation of awareness, judgment, and relational responsibility. In this way, Part 27 reinforces the central lesson of the Midas myth, that true treasure is not measured in gold or material gain, but in the depth of insight, the exercise of restraint, and the careful harmonization of desire, action, and consequence within the ongoing flow of life. King Midas endures as a symbol of the human endeavor to live wisely, ethically, and attentively, illustrating that the journey toward understanding is perpetual, that reflection and adaptation are essential, and that the cultivation of discernment and responsibility constitutes life's most enduring and meaningful legacy. King Midas, Greek Legend series continues to expand the myth into a profound meditation on the enduring human negotiation between desire, responsibility, and the cultivation of wisdom, presenting King Midas as an archetype whose life reflects the complexities of ethical growth and the subtleties of consequence. At this stage, the narrative emphasizes that the lessons of the Golden Touch extend far beyond material wealth or immediate gratification, offering insight into how the impulses that drive human ambition must be carefully observed, assessed, and harmonized with awareness of broader ethical, relational, and environmental contexts. Midas' experiences reveal that unexamined desire has the capacity to distort perception, undermine relationships, and isolate individuals from the living world, but that the careful reflection and conscious integration of these impulses can transform them into sources of understanding and moral discernment. Philosophically, Part 28 frames Midas' journey as an ongoing negotiation between longing and reflection, demonstrating that human growth is iterative, relational, and dependent upon the attentive observation of both internal tendencies and external consequences. The Golden Touch, once a literal and catastrophic curse, is now understood as a symbol of any form of unchecked power or desire, illustrating that mastery over self and circumstance requires vigilance, humility, and the recognition that ethical oversight is continuous rather than static. Midas' transformation underscores the relational nature of wisdom, showing that insight is inseparable from awareness of how one's actions affect others, including family, citizens, and the natural environment, and that ethical living is fundamentally a practice of interconnection rather than isolation. Part 28 also explores the temporal dimension of learning, highlighting that consequences often emerge gradually, and that reflection and attention are essential to recognizing patterns, mitigating harm, and cultivating habits of ethical responsiveness. The story suggests that maturity involves accepting the long arc of cause and effect, and understanding that even small actions, repeated over time, carry moral weight and shape the texture of life for oneself and others. In this sense, Midas' narrative becomes emblematic of the continuous work required to align desire with judgment, to temper ambition with care, and to translate experience into enduring insight. Moreover, the myth situates Midas' personal evolution within a wider cultural and philosophical framework, illustrating how storytelling preserves collective knowledge and encodes guidance about the responsible exercise of power, the dangers of unmoderated impulse, and the cultivation of discernment across generations. The legend emphasizes that influence, whether over resources, people, or circumstances, is inseparable from ethical attentiveness, and that failure to integrate reflection with action inevitably produces unforeseen harm. Part 28 also examines the integration of internal and external transformation, demonstrating that personal growth is inseparable from the consequences of one's conduct, and that the development of character, judgment, and restraint directly shapes the well-being of communities and the balance of natural systems. Midas' story underscores that desire, ambition, and longing are not inherently harmful, but that they require framing through ethical awareness and sustained attentiveness to consequence, reflecting the notion that true wisdom emerges from careful calibration of action and reflection. Additionally, the narrative emphasizes that the cultivation of insight is never complete. It requires ongoing practice, humility, and willingness to confront lingering impulses and recurring temptations, illustrating the iterative, lifelong nature of ethical and personal growth. The golden touch, in this context, functions as both cautionary symbol and reflective tool, reminding audiences that unexamined power and desire are never neutral, and that the richness of life is found not in possession or domination, but in deliberate participation, mindful judgment, and the harmonization of self with the relational and natural world. Part 28 thus positions King Midas as a timeless guide for understanding the interplay between impulse, consequence, and responsibility, reinforcing that the path to wisdom is continuous, relational, and deeply attentive. The legend closes this reflection by affirming that the most enduring treasure is not material wealth, but the capacity for insight, ethical engagement, and thoughtful action, offering a model for navigating human life with discernment, care, and sustained awareness. In this way, Midas' story endures as a perpetual mirror for human experience, illustrating that ethical growth is iterative, influence is inseparable from responsibility, and the richest legacy lies in the cultivation of understanding, self-awareness, and mindful participation in the ongoing flow of life. King Midas, Greek legend, series delves even further into the enduring philosophical and moral dimensions of Midas' life, examining how the interplay between desire, restraint, and reflection shapes both individual character and collective experience. At this stage, the narrative moves beyond the literal consequences of the golden touch to explore how the impulses that once drove Midas toward excess, greed, pride, and ambition, can be transformed into enduring sources of insight when tempered by awareness, humility, and deliberate reflection. Midas' story illustrates that human desire is neither inherently virtuous nor inherently destructive, but gains moral significance through the presence or absence of attentiveness to consequence, relational awareness, and ethical judgment. The golden touch, once a catastrophic manifestation of unbridled longing, now serves as a symbolic framework for understanding the ways in which unchecked impulses can harden perception, distort values, and isolate individuals from the living world, while also highlighting the potential for reflection and conscious effort to convert those same impulses into tools for learning and growth. Philosophically, Part 29 presents Midas' journey as a continual negotiation between the natural human tendency to seek advantage, recognition, or possession and the cultivated ability to act with discernment, foresight, and care, showing that wisdom is an evolving process rather than a fixed state. The narrative emphasizes that ethical insight is relational and dynamic, arising through an awareness of how personal choices reverberate through family, community, society, and the broader environment, and that the cultivation of self-restraint is inseparable from attentiveness to the interconnected systems within which life unfolds. Midas' evolution underscores the importance of integrating desire with reflection, demonstrating that the fulfillment of human potential depends on recognizing the interdependence of action and consequence, self-interest and collective responsibility, impulse and moral reasoning. Part 29 also highlights the temporal dimension of ethical growth, suggesting that the consequences of ambition and error often emerge gradually and subtly, requiring sustained observation, reflection, and responsiveness to navigate effectively. In this sense, Midas' story becomes a model for understanding how human life is shaped by iterative patterns of choice, learning, and adaptation, illustrating that personal development is inseparable from the broader ethical, relational, and ecological contexts in which individuals exist. The legend further situates Midas within a framework of narrative memory and cultural transmission, emphasizing that myths endure because they encode lessons about the responsible exercise of power, the navigation of desire, and the cultivation of moral and practical insight across generations. The golden touch thus serves as both cautionary symbol and instructive device, demonstrating the transformative potential of reflection, restraint, and conscious action, while simultaneously warning of the subtle, cumulative dangers of unexamined ambition. Part 29 explores the integration of internal and external transformation, showing that true wisdom manifests not only in the refinement of personal character but also in the thoughtful engagement with the lives, systems, and relationships that one affects, underscoring the ethical responsibility inherent in influence. Midas' journey emphasizes that desire and ambition, when aligned with reflection, care, and ethical judgment, can become productive forces for learning and leadership, but that failure to calibrate these impulses risks harm, isolation, and diminished understanding. Moreover, the narrative asserts that ethical development is perpetual, requiring vigilance, humility, and repeated self-assessment, and that the richest legacy is not wealth or power but the cultivation of insight, discernment, and relational awareness. The story conveys that human growth is dynamic, iterative, and deeply connected to the patterns of consequence that flow from every choice, reinforcing the idea that wisdom is a practice rather than a state, and that transformation occurs through continuous attention to the alignment of desire, action, and principle. Part 29 concludes by reaffirming the central moral resonance of the Midas myth, that the true measure of life lies not in accumulation or dominion, but in the deliberate cultivation of understanding, responsibility, and ethical engagement, and that the most enduring treasure is the capacity to navigate human impulses with care, reflection, and attention to consequence. King Midas, in this extended reflection, stands as an archetypal figure whose story mirrors the perpetual human endeavor to balance ambition with wisdom, desire with ethical discernment, and personal fulfillment with relational and ecological responsibility, offering a timeless guide for thoughtful, attentive, and meaningful living.